So what we're doing now is political parties, right? And this is a twofer. This is both Chapter 9 and Chapter 8 in Bars et al. American Government and Politics Today. What you have then is a combined analysis of parties and campaigns and elections, because I would argue, and hopefully you've done the reading, you'll agree that they are inextricable. They are together bound because parties control campaigns. They can't live without parties. You can't study one without studying the other. Parties and campaigns, and I've argued that parties are really nothing more than interest groups on steroids. So everything that we've done heretofore on interest groups is going to come back to sound very familiar in our deliberations tonight. But first, our seminar question. How do the goals and tactics of political parties vis-a-vis elections and campaigns advantage or disadvantage democratic theory and pluralism? Now, democratic theory, as we're going to suggest again, are those 9 key elements. It's not the idea of democracy in a broad hands swipe. Democratic theory refers to free and competitive elections, freedom of political information, political equality, majority rule, the protection of minority rights, all those elements that we've covered a couple of times in earlier lectures. Pluralism, as you know, is the vibrant marketplace of ideas. The more voices, the better. So how do the goals and tactics of parties in relation to vis-a-vis elections and campaigns advantage or disadvantage the elements of democratic theory and pluralism? And so if you're doing your thesis statement, now come on, this is child's play by now for us, right? You knock off everything that looks like a question and you make it into a statement, such as the goals and tactics of political parties as they relate to elections and campaigns, advantage and disadvantage democratic theory and pluralism. Because if I do my job right, we'll see that this is the case. So, definition, what is an interest group? Interest groups are organized groups of individuals in which members share common views and objectives and actively make an effort to influence public officials and policies. I'm reintroducing interest groups because I'm saying that political parties are not more than interest groups on steroids. So here we go again. Political parties are organized groups of individuals who share a common rough ideology, who seek to control the governing apparatus by gaining office in a duly constituted election. So they're not trying to simply influence public officials. They're not trying to simply lobby. They want to actually become government. They want to control the governing apparatus. So parties relate as interest groups insofar as the goals and tactics and how they serve a pluralistic society. We were talking about some of the roles of interest groups being to prepare their membership, to educate the electorate at large, to represent their constituents in a vibrant way. All those elements, all those roles are true of political parties as well, except that they try to become government and not just influence. Now, this is the textbook definition, and we know that we're not going to stop there, right? So I would argue a better way to look at parties is this great mnemonic of a 3-headed dragon. It's an analogy, it's a metaphor of looking at parties. Now, whenever you've seen a 3-headed dragon in action, you'll notice that the heads are always biting at each other. The idea is that each head thinks that they run the body. Each head thinks that they have the upper hand and that their worldview is correct. All 3 heads think that. And so 3-headed dragons are vulnerable to attack because they can't get their act together. They can't focus their attentions and their direction to get them going in the same place at the same time. If they have a common enemy, if they're fighting a common enemy, they can focus on that enemy for short periods of time. You see where this analogy is going, right? But when not faced with an enemy, they bicker and they bite and they fight amongst themselves, the 3 heads. So the 3-headed dragon metaphor means that there has to be 3 elements to party that are distinct, that are separate, and each one thinks that they're driving the boat. Each one thinks that their worldview should prevail. These are the party in the electorate, the party in organization, and the party in government. So when you say the Democratic Party, or the Republican Party, or the Libertarian Party, what are you referring to? Right? Are you pointing to the party in government? Are you pointing to those members of the legislature who are Republican or identified Republican or Democrat or Libertarian? Or are you referring to the state organization or the national organization or the county central committee right? What are you referring to when you say the Republicans? Or are you talking about the party in the electorate, the people who actually belong to or relate to a specific political party? You can see how this is going to go. Each one thinks that they're driving the vote. Each one thinks that their view is correct. But oftentimes there are three different views, and they fight amongst themselves. So our job is to look at the fight amongst themselves and relate it to democratic theory and to pluralism. And how does this three-pronged definition of parties advance or limit democratic theory, advance or limit pluralism? First, the party in the electorate. That's us, all right, the people who vote. Oh, wait a minute. No. It's much deeper than that. The party in the electorate is the mass of potential voters who identify with a specific party. So there are roughly 222 million eligible voters in the United States. So we have a population of 280 million. You back out the people who are from day 1 to 18 who can't vote. You back out those people who are in prison, those people who are on parole, or convicted felons, right? And you end up with about 222 million. They are the mass of potential voters. Whether they vote or not, whether their political socialization directs them to vote, drives them to vote, or if they'd rather not vote, the idea is that they are a potential voter, and so they fall into the party in the electorate. You would say, Mike, this is insane, because I would argue that perhaps those people who actually belong to a political party are the party in the electorate for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. But see, this is the problem. As I'm going to show, more people presume that they align with the Republican Party or the Democrat without actually belonging to it. There's almost a quarter of the party in the electorate who are registered voters and yet maintain independent. They aren't aligned with one or the other of the two main political parties. So if you are going to run a political campaign and you're trying to achieve the most possible votes, you look at the party membership and you look at the voting patterns of people who are registered Republicans, registered Democrats, and chances are they're going to vote for you. Actually, we have the numbers to back us up. Right? If they're registered in a party, chances are they're going to vote party lines. They're not the ones who political campaigns are directed to. They're in the bag. Don't waste your money on voters that are already going to vote for you. You want the undecideds. You want the independents. You want those people who are on the fence. And so if you're talking about the party and the electorate as the mass of potential voters who identify with a specific party, now you're talking about the focus of campaigns and elections. As I said, American voters often identify with a specific party, but rarely formally belong to it. And as we covered in political socialization in Chapter 6, party identification is usually the central political reference symbol. If you're in a cocktail party and politics come up, I swear the first thing out of somebody's mouth is going to be, well, those damn Democrats or those damn Republicans. It's going to be party identified. We know from political socialization that party identification generally comes from your parents, but the life cycle effect, as I'll show you. So understanding how we identify the party in the electorate as those persons who might potentially vote, one way to begin our analysis is to look at actual voter turnout in U.S. elections. So our next slide shows a graph ranging from 1912 to the 2018 election. You'll see that those turning out to vote for presidential elections are always significantly greater than those who turn out for midterm elections. So the excitement of a presidential election actually draw more people to the polls. As we look at how campaigns are crafted and to whom they are directed, we'll see all the more clearly how important this distinction is. As we come to our next slide, titled U.S. Party Identification Yearly Averages 1988 to 2018, we begin to differentiate the party and the electorate by those people who identify with a specific party. Now, as we discussed in political socialization, great events, recessions, wars, great personalities, very popular presidents or very unpopular presidents, can all drive party identification. And so coming from 1988 to 2018, you can see fairly significant dips and increases. And as you can see through the years, the increases and the decreases in party identification for the Republicans and the Democrats have a correlative increase in the number of people who consider themselves independents. And so party identification then is reducing. People who feel that they are Republican or Democrat are reducing, and people are drawn to considering themselves independent. In other words, they're going to vote their conscience instead of voting party lines. Now, with 26% Republican and 30% Democrat in 2018, you would think, okay, so why would the Democrats ever lose if there's 4 percentage points greater? Well, we have to look at how those independents are actually aligned. So our next slide shows U.S. party identifications, including independent leadings, annual averages. This is a Gallup poll from 1991 to 2015. We see then that the Republicans leaning Republicans and the Democrats leaning Democrat hold out, that for the most part, those independents then do consider themselves Democrat. So we're not saying that there is a distinct difference between those who consider themselves independent but actually vote Republican or actually vote Democrat. That harkens to our previous slide where there are actually more Democrats or more people who consider themselves Democrats than Republican. So the question is, again, why don't the Democrats always win? Well, voter turnout has a lot to do with that. And if we look down at the next slide, voter turnout in primary elections, and this is from 2006 to 2018, you can see that these elections then constitute roughly 30, 40, maybe 42% of the voter turnout popularly, which means to say 40% of the electorate are actually participating in the primary elections. Now, this isn't differentiated between Republicans and Democrats. So this is the sum total of persons who are eligible to vote voting, which means to say that 42% in 2018 actually drove what's considered the base of the party and the electorate insofar as what the campaign will address. Remember, primary elections are intended to rally the base, to get the base out there and to vote and to select who they want to be their presidential candidate. Well, then in primary elections, the party and organization and the party and government are trying to attract the party in the electorate to the polls. So voter turnout then, 42% of the population, is actually driving the early conversation of parties' campaigns in the beginning of a presidential cycle. Our next slide then shows the number of primary votes cast. And so again, this goes to the Democrat, the Republican, and the totals. So Democrats are actually participating in primary elections at a lesser extent in 2016 than their Republican counterparts. If you'll see then, the Democratic participation in 2016 is about 22%, whereas the Republican participation is about 28%. Which is to say, if you extrapolate this, that Republicans are more participatory, that they vote more regularly than their Democratic counterparts. And so again, if the question is, why don't the Democrats always win if there are more Democrats than Republican, voter turnout has a lot to do with it, that the Republicans tend to vote more often and more regularly than their Democratic counterparts. Another good way of examining the party and the electorate are to look at exit polls. Now, exit polls are those demographic statistics that are drawn from the last presidential election as pollsters stand outside the polling places after people vote to try to get a bead on who they voted for and who they are. And so this slide shows the 2016 presidential election results And this is CNN.com election 2016 results, exit polls. And so I would encourage you to pause this video for a moment and go into this poll to look at such key demographics as age, race, gender, education, income, religion, attitudes about abortion, about euthanasia, about same-sex marriages, about foreign relations, and you can begin to extrapolate then patterns of who is voting for what issues and why. And so this is a very useful tool to campaigns and elections as they're trying to ascertain who their base is. These exit polls will tell them what their base wants to hear, who the people voting for President Trump, let's say, want to hear, and how to get them to the polls, who the people are who would be voting for the Democratic candidate at this point in time in this lecture being Joe Biden, and what they want to hear. And so as we go into this election cycle in 2020, we're going to see the campaigns and elections drawing from the 2016 presidential election results to really rally the base and get the vote out, to get them to the polling booth. And so, again, looking at the party and the electorate, I show the next slide, which is 2016 presidential electoral vote returns. Now, this is the Electoral College, and you'll see that, on the West Coast, California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, they're solid blue. Colorado, New Mexico, solid blue. The Northeast, New England, fairly well solid blue. And then through the Midwest, through the South, Florida, Texas, etc., being solid red. And so if you're looking at the division between the Democrats and the Republicans, this is an image that the media likes to use to show the differentiation within the country along party lines. But we know that this 2016 actual presidential electoral vote returns is really a misrepresentation of what really exists. California isn't all blue. Texas isn't all red. Surely, Florida isn't all red, and Colorado isn't all blue. So the next slide, 2016 presidential returns by county level results, gives a little better indication. And again, then going into California, along the Bay Area, you can see our area, Sonoma, Napa, Mendocino, Marin, San Francisco counties are all blue, whereas the Central Valley is red, the Los Angeles Basin is blue, the Inland Empire, east of Los Angeles, San Bernardino, the desert communities are Republican, and San Diego, the high population center down there, being blue, being Democrat. And so this county level result is a little clearer, differentiating then the party and the electorate and how they're represented demographically across the country, geographically. But we have one more excellent slide, which is the 2016 by county correcting for percentages. So neither red nor blue, but shades in between. And we know then that Napa, Sonoma, Mendocino, San Francisco aren't all blue, that there are actually Republicans who live here and who are going to be voting Republican. And so this slide is a little hard to distinguish. A quick Google search will give you a better image of the slide. But for example, Sonoma County is a little bluer than Napa County. Napa County is actually a little bluer than San Francisco County. That there are fine distinctions even within our region, within the Bay Area, of demographic who will vote for which party. So again, the party in the electorate identified by county correcting for percentages, neither red nor blue. Now, the party and organization, as we're going to suggest, is an exercise in bottom-up management. One of the reasons we needed to re-record this lecture midstream, this 2020 election cycle, was that the Republican Party did not create a new party platform for 2020. They simply restated the 2016 National Republican Party platform. And so one element in the party and organization, as we're going to suggest, is creating a party platform upon which a candidate stands to represent what the party stands for, what the party policy is on important national and international issues. As I'm going to suggest in this lecture as we continue, is that the pluralist process of creating party platforms is actually a bottom-up
process. In other words, the states collectively and individually actually create their own party platform. So the California Democratic Party platform, the California Republican Party platform, and that this platform process in the states, because the parties are state entities, are collectively brought up then to the national level. So the Republican National Committee suggested in its resolution that COVID and the unusual, unprecedented situation we find ourselves in precluded the usual process by which the National Committee would come up with a party platform. Which isn't to say, then, that the 50 different states haven't been working on the state platforms for the last 2 years. They have been. And so something different, something changed in this process. And so all my arguments that the party and organization are reflective of pluralism by virtue of the development of the party platform are negated, at least in the Republican Party, by its intransigence and its failure to renew the conversation of the party platform in 2020. In other words, what the Republican Party stands for today. They're suggesting then that nothing has changed since 2016, that the Republican Party platform is the same, 2016 to 2020. And so pluralism, as I'm going to argue, is actually negated in this decision. And it is unprecedented and worrisome.
The next part then is the party and organization. Now, the party and organization is actually a pyramid. If you look at it as we'll describe it, you have the party and the electorate that is the base of the pyramid, right? It's the most numerous of the party. The party and the electorate is the mass of potential voters who might potentially vote for a party. The next level up are the party activists and volunteers. So these are the people who go a step beyond simply identifying as Republican or Democrat, but actually get off their couches, get off their butts, and do something. They are active, whether that's volunteering and going down to the party headquarters and sitting on the phone banks or going out and knocking on doors or something very active, or even something as simple as putting a lawn sign out or a car bumper sticker. That's still an activity that separates you from the mass of potential voters, yes? You're actively doing something. You're volunteering your activity. Now, so that would be the true basis. The party volunteers and activists would be the foundation. But now, let's think about this for a minute. Who's coordinating the activities of the volunteer? Not the National Democratic Party. That would be impossible. The precincts and wards, or a more common phrase, the neighborhoods. The neighborhood committees who are coordinating the activities of the volunteers in small demographic areas. For example, if I may, and I live in Roseland, which is a fairly predominantly working class, fairly Latino neighborhood with a lot of kids and some infrastructure problems. There's some potholes. And so the conversation in Roseland is going to be different from the conversation in Wild Oak. Are you familiar with those places? So Fountain Grove is, as you go into Santa Rosa, it's the hills above like Kaiser. And those homes are, good $1-2 million a piece. Nice neighborhood. It's very white. It's very upper middle class. It's very well educated. And it tends to be pretty liberal. Oakmont is on Highway 12 going out towards Santa Rosa. You pass it if you go to Santa Rosa, right on Highway 12. And it's a retirement community, age 55 or over, and they have mixed condos, private homes, apartments, right? And so that demographic is going to be different. But now you guys don't know about Wild Oak. So you go into Oakmont and you make a right. Oh, this should give you the tip. You make a right at the polo fields. And you go in through the gates, right, if you have the access code, and you go up into Wild Oak where there are multi-million-dollar homes. It makes Fountain Grove look like a trailer park. So I'm being blithe, but there's a method to my madness. If you're coordinating the volunteers for the Democratic Party, you're not going to send the same volunteer to Roseland that you're going to send to Wild Oak. You're going to have a very different message. So who's coordinating those different conversations? Who's coordinating the message to get the Democratic Party reelected? In this case, maybe a representative, maybe the senator, or maybe it's the presidential election. It's the precinct ward committees, the neighborhood committees. But wait a minute, who's coordinating the precincts and ward? The city or the county. And depending on the size of the city or the size of the county, one will be predominant over the other. But wait a minute, it gets better. You also have representative district committees. So we have the same representative, and yet we live in different cities and different counties. We need to have a representative district committee coordinating the activities of the volunteers in the precincts and the wards to have the same conversation about Mike Thompson, right, the Democrat representative in Napa and in Santa Rosa. So you have a representative district committee, and then above that you have the state committees. So the Democratic Party has put up this wonderful YouTube clip, and I wish that the Republican Party would put up one as well, and I would use it as often as I use this. I'm nonpartisan, you know me well enough by now, right? But this is so well done, I show it on a regular basis, and if anybody's a Republican, I challenge you, get one up.
If you're watching this right now, you're probably a member of the California Democratic Party or interested in how it works. This video covers some basics about the structure of the party and roles people play in it. You've probably heard about the Democratic National Committee and the convention it has every 4 years to select a Democratic nominee for president. Well, we also have a state party convention every year to make decisions about the California Democratic Party. The group that meets at the state party convention is known officially as the Democratic State Central Committee, or DSCC, and members of the DSCC are often called delegates to the state party. Now, there are 3 basic ways for someone to become a state party delegate. First, each of the 58 counties in California can have a body known as the Democratic County Central Committee. The members of these committees are elected on the Democratic primary ballot in even-numbered years, or are subsequently appointed by elected members to fill any vacancies that may exist. These committees are the Democratic Party of their county and are established and governed by California election law, so they are technically separate organizations from the state party. These county committees are charged with growing the party locally, helping volunteers plug into election-related activities, and importantly, deciding both the Democratic Party position on local ballot measures and deciding who the Democratic Party supports in local, nonpartisan races within the county. Since both Democratic County Central Committee and its abbreviation DCCC are kind of a mouthful, those terms are often avoided in favor of alternatives. In addition to being referred to as the Democratic Party of their county, they are sometimes called County Central Committees, or simply County Committees. When it comes to abbreviations, they are usually just called DCCs, with only 2 Cs, because the official name of any particular county committee begins with the proper name of the county they govern, followed by the words Democratic Central Committee. For example, the Los Angeles County Democratic Central Committee, or Los Angeles County DCC, and the Madera County Democratic Central Committee, or the Madera County DCC. Because they're separate organizations, not every member of a Democratic County Central Committee necessarily becomes a delegate to the state party. Instead, the state party gives each county party a number of delegate slots that the county party can fill in accordance with their own rules and bylaws. The number of delegate slots allocated to each county committee depends on the number of registered Democrats in the county. It's up to the county central committees to decide who they want to send as delegates. And in some counties, you don't have to be an elected member of the county central committee to be a delegate to the state party. The only stipulation is that delegates to the state party must be as evenly divided as possible between men and women. Another way to become a delegate to the State Democratic Central Committee is to be elected as a delegate by Democrats in your assembly district. There are 80 such districts in California. Every 2 years, there's an election at a meeting called the Assembly District Election Meeting, or ADEM. These meetings happen in January of odd-numbered years. You can run to be a delegate or come to the ADEM and vote for delegates if you're a registered Democrat in the Assembly District and have been since the registration deadline of the previous general election. Newly naturalized citizens and folks that turned 18 after the registration deadline can also participate if they register as Democrats at the meeting. At the ADEM, 12 delegates to the state party are elected to represent the Assembly District. If at all possible, given the group of candidates, 6 of the delegates must be men, and 6 of the delegates must be women. The delegates elected at the ADEM are often among the most active Democratic volunteers in their district. Many consider the Assembly District delegates, as they're called, along with delegates from the county committees, to be representatives of the grassroots volunteer base of the party. The final way to become a delegate comes from those who win the Democratic primary of state House races or races for California's constitutional offices, such as governor, secretary of state, etc. Everyone who wins the Democratic primary in a race like that becomes a delegate to the party, and each of them also has a number of delegate slots they can fill by appointment. The Superintendent of Public Education is a nonpartisan statewide race for which there is no primary, but the Democrat who receives the most votes in that race is treated like a Democratic primary winner. Collectively, the Democratic primary winners and their appointees make up about a third of the total delegates to the state party. Those are the three main ways to become a delegate, but here's a tip. If a delegate cannot attend a convention, they can appoint someone to be what's called their proxy, which allows that person to vote in the place of the delegate who can't attend. It's always a good idea to talk to your regional director or the chair of your county committee a couple months before the convention if you want to proxy, because there are often delegates looking for someone to proxy for them. Wow, the State Central Committee is big. So how does it make decisions? Well, it's divided in a couple of other ways to help out with this. First, there are the officers. The statewide party officers are elected for 4-year terms by the delegates at the state party convention held after a presidential election. The statewide officers include the state chair, who's the CEO and official voice of the state party and directs a lot of the party operations, one male vice chair, and a female vice chair to assist the chair in his or her duties, the secretary, who maintains the records of the party, and a controller, who has access to and reports on the financial affairs of the state party. In addition, in odd-numbered years, about 20 regional directors are elected for 2-year terms by the delegates in their region. The regions are determined based upon assembly district boundaries, with each region containing a specified number of assembly districts. The regional directors serve an important role and help link the delegates, elected officials, county committee members, and volunteers with one another and with the state party. On a day-to-day basis, most of the decisions are made by the party officers and party staff. However, the officers and staff can't make all the decisions about the state party, and it's impractical to bring the entire delegation together more than once a year. So there is also an executive board of the state party that meets a couple times a year, which is empowered to speak and make decisions on behalf of the entire state party delegation. The executive board, sometimes called the E-board, is made up of about 10% of the membership of the entire Democratic State Central Committee. That comes to about 300 people. Aside from your individual vote at the convention or potentially the E-board, there are a couple of other ways you can participate in decision making if you're a delegate to the state party. You can be on a standing committee, or you can be in a caucus. Any delegate to the state party is eligible to be on a standing committee, but must be appointed by the state party chair. The function of each of the 9 standing committees is enshrined in the party bylaws because each committee addresses an ongoing need that the party has. The standing committees are important because they allow a small number of delegates, usually 15 to 25, to focus on very specific parts of party business that require a lot of continuous and ongoing work. The caucuses, on the other hand, are self-organized groups who represent certain constituent groups within the party. There are currently about 20 of the caucuses, including the African American Caucus, the Labor Caucus, and the Veterans Caucus. Each caucus must include at least 1% of the entire state party delegation, but is otherwise allowed to determine its eligibility requirements for membership. This means that some caucuses have members, and some caucuses even have officers who are not delegates. Both the standing committees and caucuses generally meet at every convention and e-board meeting. So what do delegates or their proxies do at the state convention? We've already mentioned that they elect party officers, including regional directors. They also approve the state platform for the party, make decisions on resolutions and endorsements, and vote on other party business. Sometimes a particular issue of importance or interest will be addressed in a standing committee meeting, so delegates often attend those meetings to make their voices heard, even when they are not members of the committee. Of course, there are a lot of active Democrats in California who are not delegates. If you want to get more involved or want to be a delegate in the future, there are a number of things you can do. You can join a Democratic club in your community. These volunteer groups generally meet once a month and do a lot of important work it takes to elect Democrats and support Democratic values. You can attend and participate in your county central committee. County committees generally meet monthly at a regular time and place. The meetings are open to all Democrats, and many county committees offer associate memberships as ways for Democrats to participate even if they are not elected members. Also, the county committee members generally are allowed to select an alternate who can vote in their place when they can't attend a meeting. A lot of delegates and a lot of county committee members first got involved as alternates on a county committee. You can attend and participate in your assembly district election meetings. Check our website and sign up for our email to get more information about the ADEMs as they get closer. You can also volunteer for the state party. We always need volunteers at our meetings and during election season. It's a very exciting time to be a California Democrat. To learn more about the California Democratic Party, visit our website and get involved. Thanks for your engagement and for helping make California and the world a better place to be.
Some of the key elements that you were hearing were the diversity within the actual convention, the annual state convention. So the DCCC elected by the membership of the central committees, so the 58 counties coming together, the assembly district elections, where it's open to the public and you can come in your assembly district to vote for 12 representatives to be sent to the conference. And then finally, primary race winners or office winners. Now, even if you only won a primary race and didn't actually win the election, the plebiscite of the party or the vote within the party selecting you as the gubernatorial candidate or the candidate for the attorney general is sufficient evidence of your viability within the party to represent the party at the state level. And so this takes three different elements. If you think about it for a minute, it's the party and organization, the party and the electorate, and the party and government, each of them represented at the state convention. The party officers, statewide party officers for the Democrats in California, there are 5, 21 regional directors, and 58 county committees. We talked about that. The Republicans have 11 statewide party officers with 7 regional directors. The numbers are different. The offices are the same. It's the same structure, basically, just how they organize them. Clubs, then, in this one is the California Young Democrats of Sonoma County. Now, I like to focus this class on Napa. And I tried and tried and tried, and I wasn't able to find a viable, existing organization for young Democrats in Napa. The Young Democrats of Sonoma County is a viable organization. They have a .org. They have monthly meetings. They have conversations about the platform, the Democratic Party platform. So remember when we talked about interest groups, and I said that a lot of people belong to interest groups in a very tangential way. They may send an annual donation, but they don't really actively participate. That it's usually just one or two or a core group of people who are actually driving the interest group. This is an interest group. They're not a member of the party. They're a club. They're an interest group whose job is to influence policymaking. In this instance, the Democratic Party's policy process. Isn't that interesting? So they're not lobbying government per se, they're lobbying the party that wants to become government. So this is the Sonoma County Young Democrats. I challenge you, if you're into it, go out and found the Napa County Young Democrats if you're into it. Or perhaps you're a woman and you're a Republican. There's a club for you. And again, this isn't part of the Republican Party. This is a club, an organization, an interest group that's job is to influence policymaking in the Republican Party from the women's perspective. Now here's the beautiful thing. They're separately funded. They're not funded by the Republican Party. They have no axe to grind or no obeisance to perform to the Republican Party. They're independent, and so they can give the Republican Party a good piece of their mind. And so we're going to find in the platform women's issues in California's platform, and you can bet your bottom dollar that the California Federation of Republican Women had something to do with making sure that women were addressed in the platform. And so if you're interested in politics, you don't necessarily have to go to the organizational level. You can become active at the club level and be actually very effective and tailor it to your time availability. Having said that, there is a national party, right? We've risen then from Little Roseland up through the ranks now through the state. There is a national party. The national party only becomes active every 4 years, quadrennially. What happens every 4 years? The president is elected, right? And it's the only one national office. So it's the only time the national party really comes out to speak. And so the National Party, with the structure and organization provided by the National Committee, this party's national convention, this quadrennial or every 4-year meeting of the party's state delegates, nominate a presidential ticket and write the party's platform. So here we are finally at the real reason for the party and organization and how it relates to pluralism and democratic theory. Ready? Platform. Just like a redwood deck. So here's the key. You have a couple of 2x4s, right? And the 2x4s provide the frame. They provide the foundation for the deck. Let's say that the frame is the party. In this instance, the state party. And on that platform, on that foundation, you lay planks of wood, right? And each one of those planks represent a policy issue. Education, veterans affairs, healthcare, elder care, women, foreign affairs, capital punishment, death penalty, gun control, right? Any political issue you could possibly think of is going to be a plank. In other words, the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, develop a series of policy decisions that represent what the Republican Party is. So when you say, Mike, I'm a Republican, I challenge you, what does that mean? When push comes to shove, when you look at policy issues, what does it mean to say I'm a Republican or Democrat? You would go to the party platform. The party platform is the definitive list of policy statements on any given policy that is the Republican Party. So you have a presidential candidate, you have Mike Thompson, you have a Democratic candidate. When you're voting for them, the person. Sure, it's a candidate-centered campaign, but they're voting as a Democrat, as a Republican. And so what does that mean? How many people in here have actually looked at a party platform? I rest my case. Most people haven't, and that's cool. But if you're looking at what a party means, this is the first place to start. Now, I wouldn't lead you down the primrose path, would I, without a look at some of these party platforms. So let's go very quickly. This is presidency.ucsb, ucsantabarbara.edu, where they have a list of the Democratic and Republican Party platforms from 1840 and 1856 through present. So if you're into researching what the Democratic Party is or how the Republican Party has evolved, right, from 1856 to 2012, here's your chance. So we're able to hyperlink in, and here's the party's platforms, the Democratic Party's platform. It's called Moving America Forward. And it's going to have a preamble. It's going to have broad sweeping statements like building middle-class security, putting Americans to work, the middle-class bargain, oh, there it is, health care. So we're having a very vibrant conversation about health care now, right? And so if you voted for a Democrat, if you consider yourself a Democrat, what is the party plank on the platform about health care? The Democrats say, we believe in accessible, affordable, high-quality health care that is part of the American promise, that Americans should have the security that comes with good health care, etc. Okay, good for the Democrats. What about the Republicans? Here's the Republican Party platform. We believe in America. Oh, they both believe in America. That's good. Very good. I'm being blithe. But table of contents, we come down and job creation, small business, tax relief, American competitiveness, balancing the budget, the Federal Reserve, home ownership, infrastructure, workforce, freedom, constitutional government, defending marriage, federalism, that their plank was against universal health care coverage and against the single-payer system. So the idea that the Republicans would go to Washington and vote against universal coverage and vote against the single-payer system, that is the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, is not unthinkable because that is the platform upon which they were elected. They were doing nothing more than operationalizing or voting for the platform that had been created. Now, before we get sunk into healthcare, let me talk about the process of creating the platform first. So what you've done then is you've created 50 different state party platforms. We have the California GOP platform, right, the California Democratic platform, which is the sum total of all this, of the state convention. Right. The state convention and all the clubs chiming in and all this great conversation in and for California come up with a platform that is the California Party platform. Then 50 of those platforms come together at the quadrennial convention and they shepherd those together and they hammer out a national platform. And so you can promise the world, you can say this is what we stand on, and you can try to operationalize it. But what we're looking at, Cassidy, is the party process vis-a-vis campaigns and elections adds to or blocks democratic theory, adds to or blocks the vibrant marketplace of ideas, free and competitive elections, political equality, information. all that stuff, and pluralism, right? So this is a good instance for me to say that parties and the role of parties in campaigns and elections allow, invite, create, multiply pluralism through the platform making process. This times 50 is pluralism. Now, let me not stop here just for a minute. This is also true then of the Libertarian Party. So if you consider yourself a libertarian, what does that mean? Now, there are many viable third parties. You have to familiarize yourself. You have to educate yourself. So what does it mean? What does the Libertarian Party stand for? Now, their statement on healthcare, I know, is in here. I just read it last night. There it is. We favor restoring and reviving a free market healthcare system. We recognize the freedom of individuals to determine the level of health insurance they want. This is a very libertarian statement. Personal responsibility, personal choice. That's very libertarian. Then we come to the opposite, and we look at the Socialist Party, USA. Now, this is one of several socialist parties because they often splinter and fall apart and create new parties. But they're also going to talk about health care. And they're going to say the Socialist Party stands for a socialized healthcare system based on universal coverage, salaried doctors and healthcare workers, and revenues derived from steep graduated income tax. A steep graduated income tax means that the rich are going to pay more. Not unsurprising for the Socialist Party to believe that health care is a basic human right and should be paid for predominantly by the rich. This is what the Socialist Party is standing for. What about the Green Party? Now, the Green Party is about environmentalism, but they can't be just about environmentalism. They have to have a broader platform. And so they're going to be talking about health care as well. They're going to say they support a single-payer universal health care and preventative care for all, that health care is a right, not a privilege. So the Green Party. And so the Communist Party as well, which is pretty much socialism manifest. We'll talk about that in a couple of weeks. So, taking a deep breath. The party in government are the party members who are actually elected to government at the national, state, or local levels, which is why I was putting the kibosh on Cassidy's question about actually implementing the platform. We weren't quite there yet. We're talking about developing the platform in the organization. Now we're talking about implementing it. Now we're there. So we have, in this instance, two levels of government. We're in a federal system after all. The federal system multiplies avenues of access. We're talking about democratic theory, and so avenues of access being expanded is a plus. And so you have at the national level the Democratic and the Republican parties represented in the legislature through the Senate and the House, and at the local level, the state level, in the state Senate and the state Assembly. So I have 4 websites for you. This is the Democratic Caucus. The Democratic Caucus of the House of Representatives are all the members of the House of Representatives who are elected as Democrats, or they were elected to represent the Democratic Party in government. They were supported by the party and organization and elected by the party and the electorate. So what do they do? Well, remember, parties are interest groups on steroids. And one of interest groups' jobs is to educate the electorate. We have this website that is the caucus, the Democratic Caucus, the House of Representatives Democrat. And they have a website that is dedicated to information about the caucus, issues that the caucus is dealing with, news about the caucus, legislation that the caucus is working on, information about the House. Now, I don't need to lead you too far down the path. This isn't for the caucus members. They know what their job is. They know what their schedule is. They know what they're working on. This website isn't for them. Who is the website for? Us, the party and the electorate. Oh, wait a minute. Not even necessarily the registered members of the Democratic Party. They're already in the bag. If we're talking about campaigns and elections being a permanent cycle, what you're doing here is you're using this website to educate the potential voters for the Democratic Party in the next election. They're already doing this. I heard on the NPR on the way over that the Republican Party is already running ads in the South about the Affordable Care Act, about Obamacare, with an eye to 2014 and the midterm elections next November, a year from now, that they've already started the process of educating the population to try to get them on board to vote Republican in the fall, next fall, yes? That's what this is doing as well. They're an interest group. They're educating the population. They're trying to get the potential voters to get on the side of the Democratic Party. Now, here's the gig. How many people knew that there was a House caucus website before tonight? Okay. So this is my idea, that they're pointing this to the attentive public. The attentive public are those people who have more political information, have higher political socialization. We covered this in Chapter 6, right? The mass public, the people who are reactionary, the people who react, who don't have a lot of political information and who don't vote, aren't going to be looking at this information. This is directed to the attentive public. If this is an example of a permanent campaign, the campaign is to get you to vote in the next election for them. This is part of the campaign material. This is part of the 2014 political campaign, to get you, the attentive public, especially the undecided voter, to vote Democrat in 2014. The same is true for the Republican. The Democrats call themselves a caucus. The Republicans call themselves a conference. Tomato, tomato. It's the same gig. It's the same deal. They just use a different word to describe it. It's like a herd of cattle, right? Or a bevy of swans. It's just a different way of naming the collective. So the Democratic caucus, the Republican conference, this has the same gig. The Republicans in the lower chamber of the legislature. Now, you've heard about the Tea Party, yes? You've heard about the government shut for 16 days, right? You've heard about this. Now, the Tea Party isn't a party. It's not a viable third party. It's a loose ideology. It's actually 3 or 4 different ideologies as represented by Republican candidates who get elected to, in this instance, the lower chamber, the House of Representatives, as Republicans. The Tea Party movement is a loose ideology, and it really kind of changes on a day-to-day basis. It isn't a party in organization. There is no Tea Party. It doesn't exist. There is a Tea Party caucus website, and it threw me for a loop. I had a heart attack the first time I saw it, until I realized it was one representative, in this case Michelle Bachmann, who decided to create a Tea Party caucus website, but the misnomer is they're not Tea Party members, they're Republicans. So they belong by definition to the Republican conference. So here's the gig. The Speaker of the House, the Majority Leader, are unable to corral the 19 new Tea Party identified Republicans to get them in line with Republican ideology and the Republican platform, because they've been elected as mavericks within the Republican Party. So the Republican Party in government is split on ideological lines, causing a break in the ranks that makes it almost impossible to govern the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. The idea then is you have the party in government that's responsible to the party and organization that's trying to attract the party in the electorate. Now, let me very quickly just reiterate, this is also true at the local level with the California State Assembly, the Republican caucus, and the California State Assembly Democratic caucus. The first 2 were in Washington. The second 2 are in Sacramento. Remember, federalism provides a dual citizenship in a compound republic. So you have 2 opportunities to participate, both at the national and at the state level. So this then, again, is the Democratic and Republican caucuses at the local level. Now, going back to my other contention just very quickly here, you have the party and organization that is this state organization every 4 years speaking to creating a national organization, but is really a very grassroots interest group-based mechanism. The party activists and volunteers who do the bulk of the work at the local level, taking their cues from the state and sometimes from the national party. But really the party and organization is very low level, very grassroots. The party in government is in Washington, the people who are actually elected. The party and the electorate are those people who might potentially vote along the party lines or for a party's candidate. So we have 3 heads of the dragon. Now, the party and organization, as I suggested, recruits candidates for the party in government. As Clara mentioned, right, if you want to become active in politics, a good way to do it is to become active in the party and organization and to show who you are and your mettle and how hard you work and your ideas to come to their notice so that they can support you in your candidacy in the future. But candidates are less reliant than ever on the party and organization. Why? The advent of television, mass media, and now the internet. So whereas before the party and organization provided the structure, the means, the mechanism, the organization to get a candidate's name out there and talk about them and get them in the papers and get name recognition and build their candidacy for them, the candidates don't necessarily need all that support anymore. They can go to the internet directly and get support without the party. This is how the Tea Party caucus is circumventing the Republican organization. The party in government responds to the party and organization by trying to operationalize its platform. So it responds to the policy views and helps strengthen the party organization every time the party in government speaks to the party platform, speaks to the party and organization. The party in government is made stronger because you have that link, that connection, that is going to help them attract the party and the electorate. The party and organization mobilizes the party and the electorate and coordinates the activities of the volunteers. The party and the electorate provides the volunteers to the party and the organization. The party and the electorate actually elects the party and government, and then the party and government responds to the policy views of the party and the electorate as they're represented in the party and organization. So, I say the Republican Party, I say the Democratic Party. Who do I mean? Is it the party and government, the party and organization, or the party and the electorate? I go back to my original contention. Three-headed dragon. Each one thinks that they're right. Each one thinks that they have all the information they need, but they can't operate unless they act cohesively. For example, you have the party and government providing implementation of, in this instance, the 1992 Republican Party platform. In 1992, the Republican Party lost, as you know, bringing Bill Clinton into the Oval Office, into the White House. But in 1994, in the midterm election, the Republicans resurged and won back the House of Representatives, which often happens in a midterm election. The party in the White House loses seats in the lower chamber in the House. The party platform that the resurgent Republican Party brought with them into their newly recaptured House of Representatives was operationalized and called Contract with America. The Speaker of the House for the Republican Party at this time was a name that might be familiar to you, Newt Gingrich. He was a candidate in the last presidential election. He was Speaker of the House at the time. And he tried to operationalize the platform by creating a slate of legislation called Contract with America. Now this is 10 elements, but not one of them passed. Not one of them were successful. Even if you're elected, you're not necessarily successful. The success is in the discourse. It's in the conversation. So they were unable to affect any of the platform's planks, even though they had the majority in Congress, the majority in the House of Representatives. And we're talking pretty basic stuff. A balanced budget act, stronger sentencing, reduced welfare rolls, tax credits, small business incentives, and one that would have been a constitutional amendment instituting term limits at the national level. The two-party system is what we have. As Clara mentioned, she didn't even really realize that there were viable third parties, and that's not uncommon. If you were a Martian coming down, looking at our political system, you would say there are two parties. There's a reason for this. One, the historical basis, the Federalist Papers, which is why I jumped up and down so much. Most of you got it. That it founded the two-party system by creating the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. Boom, you have the historical basis. Secondly, the force of tradition takes over. Political socialization. We have two parties. We've always had two parties. We're always going to have two parties. The force of tradition, the force of we always have done it this way. There are also structural factors. Two, I'll give you very, very quickly. One is the single-member district, and second is the plurality or the election law. Single-member district. So we've been talking about Mike Thompson all night. Imagine instead of a single-member district or a district that can only have one member, what if you had three? And they couldn't all be of the same party. Just imagine. So you vote in a Republican, you vote in a Democrat, and then you have a third choice. What would that choice be? If you couldn't vote for a Democrat or a Republican, what is the true tone of Napa County? Where would you guys really fall? Would it be Libertarian? Would it be Green? Would Would it be socialist? Well, you would have a viable third party that would be trying to capture what the Republicans and the Democrats did. But alas, we don't. We have a single member district. So that single member district perpetuates the two-party system. Secondly, plurality. Even if you have 5 candidates of 5 different political parties, the person who wins the most votes, the plurality of votes, wins office. So you can have candidate A getting 25% of the vote, candidate B getting 24%, C 22%, D 23%. That candidate A with 25% of the vote gets the plurality, not the majority, the plurality, the most, and so he wins. But really, there's a lack of an American ideological consensus. Even considering the historical basis, the force of tradition, and the structural factors included, if there were enough consensus in the American electorate for a third party, there's nothing stopping us from electing a third party candidate. For example, Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt came into office at McKinley's assassination, handpicked his successor, William Howard Taft, and went off to Africa to shoot big game. He came back and his handpicked successor wasn't doing the office justice, or so felt Teddy Roosevelt. So he went back to the Republican Party and said, you need to run me again. Now this is before Franklin Roosevelt, the 2-term limit. So he had the constitutional ability to run again, but the Republican Party didn't want to run him. He had had his time in the sun and they wanted to move forward. So the man went out and formed his own party, the Bull Moose Party. Now, he didn't call it the Bull Moose Party because he was green or because he was conservationist or because he was a big game hunter. He was giving a speech and he got shot while he was giving the speech. The man continued to give a speech, finished his speech, went backstage and clapped. So they called it the Bull Moose Party because the man himself was a bull moose, right? And you couldn't bring him down. He almost won. He almost won that election. If you have a charismatic personality like Teddy Roosevelt, or a cataclysmic event like abolition or the Civil War with Abraham Lincoln and the Republican Party, you can have a third-party candidate, a viable third-party candidate. Force of tradition, the historical basis, the structural factors are stacked against a third-party candidate. So what are some of these third parties? This is just a small splattering. The American Fascist Party, how about that for a contradiction in terms? The American Heritage Party, the American Independent Party, the American Reform Party, Labor Party. How about the Marijuana Party? Woohoo! The American Nihilist Party, right, which is basically the anarchist or no government, the American no government party. That doesn't make sense. The Union Party, Peace and Freedom Party. There's a whole slew. Now, for example, sadly, one of the elements in third parties not having viability is the tone of the candidates they're able to put forward. Now, Teddy Roosevelt notwithstanding, or Ross Perot with his own money notwithstanding, I give you the last gubernatorial election in California, where the Libertarian candidate, and I won't name names, listed as one of his qualifications for governor as that he played in high school band. And so I'm looking at the viability of third-party candidates thinking, really? Really? This is the best you can do. We go back to the party and organization because it's the party and organization that vets and puts forward nominees. So I would point the finger not at the candidate, but at the party and organization that failed to recruit a candidate that could be a good challenge to, well, in this case, Jerry Brown. So our seminar question, as we know, is how do the goals and tactics of political parties, vis-a-vis elections and campaigns, advantage or disadvantage democratic theory and pluralism? And so to construct a thesis statement for this seminar question, again, all we do is we knock off anything that smells like a question, right? Like how do, and the question mark, and we make it into a statement such as the goals and tactics of political parties, vis-a-vis campaigns and elections, let's say advantage and disadvantage, democratic theory and pluralism. And so what we're trying to do then is to show how the role of parties, the role of interest groups, in campaigns and elections both help to have free and competitive elections, help to have political equality, free flow of political information, free political socialization, right? And pluralism, which is the vibrant marketplace of ideas. But as I'm going to show going through our roadmap tonight, this can be both a benefit and a detriment. So we're starting then with campaigns, nominations, and elections. And this is a linkage political institution. Campaigns and elections are how we, the people, we, the electorate, link through to our government. This is our connection, constitutionally. Now, we know that we can write letters, we can protest, we can wear armbands, we can myriad ways of contacting, of participating in our government. But this is the one constitutional way. This is the linkage between the electorate and the government. So our roadmap today is to first look at the 21st century campaign. How are campaigns different today than they were 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 230 years ago? And how does that benefit or detract from democratic theory? How does it benefit or detract from pluralism? We're going to talk about the 4 stages of campaigns and elections. We're going to look at primaries and caucuses. We're going to look at the nominating convention at the national level, the quadrennial convention. We're going to look at general elections, how the elections actually take place. And then we're going to have an in-depth examination of the Electoral College, or how the president is selected according to the Constitution and according to the 12th Amendment. We're going to look at voter turnout, and we're going to examine the pros and cons of a high or low voter turnout, and what that means for democratic theory and what it means for pluralism. And we're going to talk about campaign finance as a pro and con to democratic theory, and in relation to the notion that being able to give $1 to a political campaign constitutes freedom of speech, or at least the Supreme Court has found that it is freedom of speech. So we'll talk about campaign finance reform, and then limits taken off campaign finance reform, such as Citizens United, a recent Supreme Court case that held corporations had the same rights as people insofar as contributions to political campaigns. So everybody's copacetic with our roadmap thus far? We're good to go? Okay, excellent. And so the 21st century campaign requires, as you would imagine, especially at the national level, a very strong organization, expertise in political polling and marketing, professional assistance in fundraising, because fundraising is its own kettle of fish, how to get people to contribute to your political campaign, accounting and financial management, because when you're dealing with these kinds of dollars, these millions and millions of dollars, and reporting mechanisms to the federal and to the state electoral boards, you need to have a good, strong accounting and financial management team on board. And especially in the age of the internet, a very strong technical capability. And so a web presence, a Twitter presence, a Facebook presence. I can't even imagine the levels of technological need that we're going to have in the next 15 to 20 years. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a change in campaigns. Imagine campaigns and elections before most households even had a television, how different they may have been. Campaigning was personalized. We had whistle-stop tours, standing on the end of a train, going throughout the country or going throughout the state or the representative district on a campaign junket, giving speeches, meeting people, kissing babies, right? The old campaign style. Today, they're often less actually personal, whereas they're candidate-centered. In other words, we center on the personality and the looks and the feel of the candidate. Actually, meeting the candidate is less likely today than it was 30, 40 years ago. And being less personal, voters often receive their political information through the media, through some kind of mediated source. So if we're no longer meeting the candidates in person, what we're getting are small 30-second, 60-second sound bites, or perhaps parts of political speeches that are being made. And so also, by advent of the introduction of television and now the internet and internet media, campaigns have become less party-centered. The need of the party and organization to nominate and to support a candidate is less so now than it has ever been. And that makes the campaigns more candidate-centered, less party-centered, less party platform-founded, and more candidate-centered. So very quickly, and we'll talk about this when we get to the Electoral College, imagine there was a significant difference in the popular culture at the time, in that it was considered unseemly for somebody to seek political office. What you did is that you sat in your home, you sat in Mount Vernon, you sat in Monticello, and you waited for the country to come to you to ask you to serve, to call you into service. To actually run for political office was unseemly. It was ungentlemanly. There was something wrong with you that you would seek political office. Political office was something that you were called to. So imagine the difference then today, right, when we have candidates actively seeking office and the campaigns that back their efforts, it's a completely different kettle of fish. But again, this is going to change in the mechanisms of campaigns and elections, and we're going to be correcting for a lot of the elements of democratic theory as we continue through the evolution of the campaigns and elections. So we'll come back to that anon. So now it's even commonplace for candidates of local offices, school board, city council, mayors, boards of supervisors of counties, etc., to have professional campaigns or to have a political consultant who is paid, hired to devise a campaign strategy and to manage a campaign for city council, for a county supervisor. And so remember, for each layer of professionalism that's helping in your political campaign, we're talking money, right? The more television ads, the more internet, the more money we're talking about. The more money we're talking about, the more influence that political action committees and special interests are going to have in your election. The more influence they have in your election, the more likely it is that democratic theory and pluralism is going to come into play. So we'll come back to that when we talk about campaign finance reform. So in conducting a campaign, we have these three elements that should be brought to mind. And again, they relate directly to democratic theory and pluralism. First, we have to think about candidate visibility and the appeal. The campaign must constantly devise strategies to keep the candidate before the public in a positive light. Now, very quickly we throw on the brakes because we have two types of candidates. We have the incumbent candidate and the outsider candidate. Your book talks about this in chapters 8 and chapter 9. So the incumbent candidate has what's known as the incumbent advantage. But 90% of representatives, i.e. the lower chamber of Congress, 90% of people standing for office are returned to office, 90%. So this incumbent advantage means that if you're an outsider, if you're trying to get office, you're going to be running an uphill battle. Candidate visibility and appeal is an important strategy in winning a political campaign. One benefit that the incumbent candidate has is they're able to have a constant campaign or a permanent campaign. For example, so you're elected to the House of Representatives, let's say, and you go to Washington and you sit at your desk. What's the first thing you do? The first thing you do. You call your mom, right? Mom, I made it, I'm here. Okay, now what's the second thing you do? You start running for re-election. Because 2 years is going to go by in the blink of an eye, and you're running a constant campaign, a permanent campaign, which means that everything that you do in office is going to be done with an eye to at least a reasonable assumption that you're already running for re-election. So what you do today, how you vote on an issue today, on a piece of legislation today, is going to affect your chances of being re-elected in 2 years. Not just that, but remember, money talks. And so if a part of a political campaign is to have a professional organization, that professional organization costs money. And if it's money, then you're dealing with interest groups and PACs and people who are going to contribute to your campaign. So already you're beginning to attract your war chest for your next campaign. In other words, you're going to be looking at each piece of legislation, not only how it's going to affect the electorate and your constituency, but how it's going to pass muster or not with the people who are contributing to your political campaign. How do interest groups and PACs ascertain whether you're a viable candidate? Tracking polls. And we talk about this in chapter 6. A tracking poll is a poll done on a nearly daily basis, especially as election day approaches, about the electability of a candidate. And so if you don't have name recognition, or worse, if you have negative name recognition, a political action committee, as discussed in chapter 7, those interest groups whose job it is to contribute to your campaign money, is not going to trust you, is not going to invest in your campaign. If you don't have strong name recognition, if you don't have strong viability, if you don't stand a snowball's chance in hell of getting elected, nobody's going to give you any money. And so tracking polls are very important. Now, tracking polls mean how the electorate sees your electability. And so it may be a year before the election, but you're already thinking the next campaign cycle and how your electorate, how your constituency is going to view you in tracking polls for your viability in the next election because you're already trying to attract donors to your next campaign war chest. This is also done not just through tracking polls, but through focus groups. You've heard this term, right? A focus group is a small group of individuals who are led in a discussion by a professional consultant to gather opinions on and responses to candidates and issues. So this is different from a tracking poll. A tracking poll says, if Mike Cry were to run for office next year, how would you vote for him? Yes or no? That's my viability. But a focus group says, okay, we have some issues going on. Let's say I'm a representative in our representative district. Let's say it has to do with infrastructure. How is Mike Cry perceived vis-a-vis infrastructure? In other words, do you see him bringing back to the representative district funding to improve the highways, funding to improve the waterways, funding to improve buildings, or any federal projects that might bring oomph back to the district? What are the hot topics that we're dealing with in the next campaign cycle? Is it immigration? Is it healthcare? And knowing what these topics are and whether you're hot or cold, you the people, you the electorate, constituency, is hot and cold on a certain subject, will tell me how to vote because I'm trying to attract your support, right? And so if you're hot on a topic, boy, I'm hot on a topic. If you're cool on a topic, you don't care very much, I can let it go. You follow? So this idea of governing is conflated now with a constant campaign. Whereas before, governing and campaigning were two different issues. The rise in the media-centered and the candidate-centered campaign means that we now have governing and campaigning that are really one thing. They're conflated. They're intertwined. Now, we're talking about democratic theory, and we're talking about pluralism. Is this idea of the constant campaign good or bad for democracy? It can be argued either way. So, in a campaign and the election that concludes it, one would argue that all the actors in the political process come into vigorous interplay. Parties begin by selecting and promoting candidates. Interest groups mobilize their forces to ensure that their interests are being remembered. The mass media put politics more clearly and consistently at center stage. And as a result, the public, whose interest in political affairs is generally fairly limited, we touched on this in political socialization, now turns its attention to the candidates vying for public office. So this lecture then, the next part of this, examines the process from the perspectives of the two principal types of players in the drama, the voters and the candidates. For voters, the basic questions are whether to vote and how to vote. Candidates, whether presidential or congressional, must devise strategies that will bring voters to the polls and attract their votes. So they must pull together to get the financial resources and organization needed for a viable, credible campaign, to obtain the nomination of their parties through the nominating convention, and compete against each other as the party's candidate in a general election or campaign. And so in organizing the campaign, what are your tasks? Well, you have to get a good campaign manager. You may be a hotshot legislator. You may know government well, but you're going to be so active and so wrapped up in making appearances and making speeches and glad-handing and being a candidate that you're not going to have the time to actually manage your campaign. So you need a professional campaign manager on your staff. You need to get a fundraiser, somebody whose job it is specifically to get out there and to stump and to raise money for you, whether that's through individuals, small donations of individuals, perhaps through Facebook or through Twitter, through some mechanism to call in those $5, $10, $20 donations, but also the big guys, the big puppies, the PACs, the Political Action Committee, and a counsel. You're going to need a lawyer. Believe it or not, you're going to need somebody who can interpret campaign law and election laws to make sure that you don't step on any landmines. Right? Perhaps you're an incumbent. One of the aspects of running for office is that you can't use any resources that you have by virtue of being an elected official for your campaign. For example, Al Gore, when he was running for president as vice president, used his phone, right, his office phone, to call, I think it was a Buddhist monastery, to help coordinate a speech that he was going to give there. That was an improper use of, in this instance, national infrastructure to run a political campaign. Now you would think, this is a simple phone call, what the heck? No, because it gives that candidate an unfair advantage over somebody who's not an incumbent. You follow? And so you're going to need a lawyer, right, to keep you abreast and to warn you off such simple things as picking up the phone in your office. You're going to need to hire media and campaign consultants, because unless you know Facebook, unless you know how the media works, how Twitter works, you're going to lose out on a lot of publicity. You're going to need to assemble a staff. All these people that I've talked about already are going to need people to actually do the work. These are the chiefs. You need Indians. You need people to stamp the envelopes and to lick the envelopes and to get out there and stump, and to plan the logistics to get you from point A to point B. You're going to need research staff. You're going to need policy advisors. You're going to need pollsters. And most importantly, you're going to need a great press secretary, somebody to get your name in the press, somebody to get your name out there in front of the public on a regular basis. Wow. All this just to stand for office, just to be considered a viable candidate. Now, when we talk about the high-tech media campaign, there are certain elements to this as well. The use of direct mail to generate support and money for the candidate is something that happened in the 1950s and the 1960s. Direct mail, those postcards that you start to get in droves come election time, right? These are still useful. They're best for name recognition, to get your name out there so that the public acknowledges, they see, they recognize your name, but also for hot topic issues. Now, they don't go into great detail about where you stand on an issue, but it's called almost a dog whistle, right? So the people who are listening for immigration, business reform, campaign election reform, healthcare reform, these important issues appearing on and direct mailing with your name on it is sufficient to tie the policy and the candidate together to raise name recognition and to raise viability. It's also possible to get media attention through an ad budget, but best through free coverage. If you can get the newspapers or the internet media to cover your campaign for free, this is the best. So how do you do that? You have press conferences, you have media events that get the newspapers interested in you. So my best example for this is Harvey Milk. So Harvey Milk was the first openly gay elected official in the United States. He served in San Francisco on the Board of Supervisors. You may know his name. He was assassinated, about 35 years ago now. He had this great media savvy, and one of his key issues was dog poop on the streets and in the park. And this was one of his issues, and he was going to clean up San Francisco, and he was going to introduce legislation in San Francisco policy to strengthen the anti-dog poop policies, right? And so he staged a media event where he was walking down the street, and the media were following him, and he was giving a speech, and he stepped in some, right? And they showed him, like, scraping it off his shoe. This is brilliant. Talk about free advertising, free press, right? And it was something that everybody can relate to. It was a little funny. I mean, we're talking dog poop, right? So it was a little funny, and boy, it was useful. You can still see it. It's quintessential political media use. It's brilliant. Now, you also have the emphasis on marketing a candidate. Really what you're doing, if you're standing for office, is you're marketing yourself. So you're branding yourself, you're coming up with strategies to increase name recognition and linking your name to important policy issues. So you're marketing yourself. And the news focuses on strategies and events, not on policies. If we remember from Chapter 6, Political Socialization, we had argued that most people are less familiar with policy than they are with the candidate-centered campaign. So your campaign game, your use of the high-tech media is going to focus on strategies and events like stepping in dog poop, then on the actual policy, the workings of the policy to strengthen policies. Check. Good. So now we're off to our next part of this lecture, which is to look at the 4 stages of campaigns and elections. Now this is covered in your book in Chapter 9, but I'm also, as you know, folding in chapters 7 and 8, so interest groups and parties, as they relate to how the 4 stages of a campaign and election progress. And so we're looking at caucuses and primaries as stage 1, and we're calling that battle for the party faithful. Stage 2 is the nominating convention, which is the candidate-centered campaign. Stage 3 is the actual general election, or the fight for the undecided, how an election actually works. And we're going to introduce the Electoral College, right, which was created in the Constitution and then amended with the 12th Amendment, how that works and its intent as a filter on the public's vote. I'm going to read a little bit, just a paragraph out of a book that I wrote, published a couple years ago. It's called Trouble at the Border, A Contextual Approach to the Study of Immigration Policy in the United States. And it talks about parties insofar as a candidate-centered campaign. Political parties are organized groups of individuals working toward expression of their shared ideals by placing the reins of government in the hands of those who represent their ideologies. A party defined through a three-faceted structure, and this is touched on in Chapter 8, which is the party and organization, the party and government, and the party and the electorate, is highlighted by the activities of campaigns during election cycles and by ideological and pragmatic policy platforms. A casual observer might see similarities by this definition with interest groups. In Chapter 7, while parties and pressure groups share similarities, there are significant differences between them, most noticeably that parties work to become government by controlling the apparatus thereof, while interest groups are content to merely influence national, state, and local governments' legislative, executive, bureaucratic, and judicial actions, as discussed in Chapters 7 and 8. Another way to differentiate between parties and interest groups is by dissecting parties into their three component parts: the party and organization, the party and the electorate, and the party and government. So the intent of these four stages in my talk is to further develop the basic definitions of these three components, electorate, government, and organization, by using them to examine responses to the campaign cycle. And so we start then with caucuses and primaries. Now, remember, we're talking about democratization and democratic theory. Democratic theory holds for free and competitive elections, the free flow of political information, political equality, the majority rule, but the protection of minority rights, the free evolution of political socialization. So we're looking at caucuses and parties expanding democratization, expanding democratic theory, that through the processes of caucuses and primaries, the people electing their leaders are actually expanding, in some instances by a total of two, their participation in democracy. So caucuses. Delegates select the party's choice for presidential campaign in a caucus. A caucus is a closed meeting of party members of the states. This is different from a primary, and your book talks about these in Chapter 9. Currently, 6 states offer party caucuses to select their presidential nominees. Again, it's meetings of party leaders to select their delegates. It's not an open primary. It's not the party membership voting for a candidate, it's the party leaders. So the party and organization has pride of place over the party in the electorate. It's really organized like a pyramid from the local precincts to the state's conventions. So you begin the conversation in the party leadership, in the party organization, at the lower levels, the precinct, the neighborhood committees, rising up through the city and county committees, the representative district committees, finally to the state conventions. And at the state convention then, they hold the caucus, right? Or the party leaders come together as a result of the conversation that happened to select their party's nominees. Again, it's not used by many states, and Iowa's is considered the most important. Anybody's guess why? It's the first. It's the first of the party caucuses. By holding it first, as I'll show you, they have pride of place because they can begin the conversation in the campaign. Primaries. Primaries are special elections. Now, this isn't an open general election. These are special elections where the party membership select candidates to be the party's nominee, in this instance for the president in a general election. The primary season is generally January through June of the presidential election year, every 4 years. And it's the party organizations, for the most part, who decide the rules for the primaries in a particular state. So in a state then, how a primary is run or how a primary is conducted is up to the party and organization. The party and organization is polling, is asking the party and the electorate, those members of the party out there among the electorate, who they want to be a candidate. So it's the party and organization that's actually conducting the process. Now, you may remember from last presidential election cycle that Florida wanted to move its primary much earlier. I'm seeing heads nod, right? So you think, okay, what's wrong with this? The national party helps coordinate the activities of the state parties, and if the state party wants to hold its primary much earlier, it's not just going to affect that state, it's going to affect the nationwide party because it's going to upset the apple cart. We have a very staid, very structured process of primaries and caucuses, Iowa being the first caucus, New Hampshire being the first primary, and this force of tradition ensures that the parties are going to maintain that structure. So Florida was challenged by the national party that if they held their primary early, that their delegates, or the delegates to the national convention, would be discounted. They would be not included in the vote. So Florida could go ahead and change its primary and make it earlier if it wanted to, because it had that right, but there were ramifications to be had at the national level. So this is the party and organization deciding how and when and why. And again, we're talking democratic theory. So primaries, then, are the other side of caucuses. If caucuses are only the party leadership getting together, primaries are actually the electorate, the party and the electorate coming together as a plebiscite to gauge the party membership temperature for any one political candidate. So who the nominee is going to be from California, right? And so this is started by turn-of-the-century reformers. The primary process was actually a progressive era reform. Your book talks about Tammany Hall and the overly strong political parties, especially at the local level. I'm thinking the movie Gangs of New York with Leonardo DiCaprio. You may remember that, okay? This overly strong central party at the local level using its weight through patronage, through intimidation, through extortion, to maintain its hold, its place in government. So the progressive era reform was intended to break the overly strong control of parties at the local level. And so primaries are an attempt, are a mechanism to achieve that. If you think of caucuses as the party leadership getting together to name its nominee, now you're putting that decision out with the electorate. And so the party leadership's voice, the party and organization's voice, is going to be lessened, or at least it's going to be mitigated by the voice of the party and the electorate through primaries. So it's an open plebiscite, it's an open election among the party membership. Most states use one of the forms of primary, either an open primary or a closed primary. Again, many primaries are early, January, New Hampshire being the first, and generally they serve as elimination contests. We really remember from the last presidential campaign, the Republicans had quite a number of candidates, this constant flow of candidates who kept appearing and disappearing on the Republican ticket. And they kept rising and falling in relation to each other in their tracking polls, in their viability, in their electability. But as you watched through the primary process, beginning first in New Hampshire and then coming down one by one by one, the candidates began to be ticked off. And it became clear that in this last instance, Mitt Romney was going to be the nominee for the Republican Party. But that was a vetting process, right? At first, you had a whole slate of candidates. Then primary after primary got whittled down. So it really is an elimination contest. The shadow primary, if you talk about the viability of candidates, we think that this process actually starts out long before anybody casts a vote in a primary election. This is by raising money. So before you can even begin to think about running in a primary, you have to have your campaign strategy, your campaign organization already in place, long before the first primary vote is cast, right? And so the shadow primary, if you look at the viability of candidates, means how they can attract campaign financing, how they can attract donors, right? So long before January, long before New Hampshire, you have candidates already ramping up, right? Long before anybody casts a vote, you're already running for office. Now, again, there are different types of primary depending on the state. You can have a closed primary where the voter is limited to choosing candidates of the party in which he or she is a member. So in California, we have a closed primary. So if you're a registered Democrat, you can vote in the Democratic primary, right? Or if you're a registered Republican, some states have open primaries. An open primary in which any registered voter can vote, but they must vote for candidates for one party only. So if you're a registered Republican in an open primary state, you can go in and cast a primary vote. It doesn't have to be for the Republican candidate. It can be for the Democratic candidate. And so there are pros and cons vis-a-vis democratic theory, free and competitive elections, for both elements, for both sides. You can argue, and we will. So you can also have a blanket primary. Now these are less used, where a voter can vote for more than one party, or you can have a runoff primary. So in some states there are actually two primaries. If no candidate receives a majority of the votes, then the top two candidates compete in another primary that's called a runoff, or a runoff primary. So again, a closed primary, voters may vote in a party's primary only if they're registered members of that party. In an open primary, a registered voter may vote in any party primary regardless of his or her party affiliation. Going back to the timing of primaries, it's called front-loading the primaries. So each state determines the date for its primary or caucus, check, with the blessing of the national party. But because early primaries are more influential, they're the ones who have the full slate of candidates. They're the ones who are going to have the broadest conversation about the viability of these candidates. Because they're the first, they're more influential. In other words, their response to the slate of candidates is going to have more of an impact than those primaries held at the later date. States have competed to schedule their primaries as early as possible. And so by choosing the nominees early and earlier and earlier and earlier, this is another reason that the National Convention would most likely want to slow down the process. The lull between the primaries and the actual general election is that much longer, right? And so imagine if you start in January, but now Florida wants to jump the gun and start this December before, right? And then California will start the November before, because each one has more influence if they're starting earlier. Well, there's your answer, actually. So what you have then is the national organization saying, no, we need to keep the voters' attention. We need to keep their passion, right? So we can't spread it out too far. I mean, voter attention span is only so long, and 9 months is long enough. Make it out to a year or 16 months, and we'll start losing interest in the parties altogether. So public choice theory that your book talks about in Chapter 3 talks about federalism and the role of federalism in attracting people to live within a state's borders, dependent on that state's laws. So if you're a retiree and you're on a fixed budget, perhaps you want to move to Nevada, where there is no income tax. Or perhaps you want to move to Oregon, where there is no sales tax, right? So if you move to a state because the policy of that state attracts you, either as a voter or as a taxpayer, this is called public choice. Using our choice to live in any different state by virtue of what that state is offering us, right? So perhaps you're a strong believer in euthanasia, or perhaps you want to take advantage of euthanasia, doctor-assisted suicide, right? Perhaps you would move to Oregon, that has a very progressive stance on euthanasia. Perhaps you like smoking pot. Maybe you're going to move to Colorado, that now has a recreational marijuana policy. So moving to a state by virtue of its policy is called public choice. Public choice theory then takes this idea of public choice and applies it to, in this instance, the party models in each of the different states. So this map shows a number of states as differentiated by whether they have a closed caucus, an open primary, an open caucus, a closed primary, a semi-closed primary, a semi-closed caucus, and what you're looking at is the different states and how they conduct their party plebiscites, their party elections. Now, without getting into the mix of one versus the other, Look at that rainbow of colors. Some states have open primaries, some have closed. Some have open caucuses, some have closed. This diversity of color means that there's a diversity of types of primaries and types of caucuses. And if we're looking at pluralism, our seminar question asks us to look at campaigns and elections vis-a-vis pluralism. We've done it. Look at that. That is pluralism exemplified, where you have a divergent means of nominating a party's candidate depending on what state you're in. So federalism is alive and well, public choice is alive and well, and the primary caucus system conducted by the states specifically underscore that pluralism in campaigns and election is extant. Then we also have the presidential primaries and caucuses by month. The dark blue on the left-hand side shows those primaries and caucuses that are held in January. And then the lighter you get through June, which is absolutely white, you have the flow of primaries and caucuses across a 6-month period. For the election cycle, the campaign cycle, beginning in January through June, you're having a constant barrage, a constant calendar of primaries and caucuses happening. So you're keeping the voters' attention because it's constantly in the news. So now what we're looking at is the nominating game, the nominating convention. We covered the first part now of our 4 stages, which was primary and caucus, and now we're moving into competing for delegates. The delegates are those people who are going to attend the quadrennial convention of the Democratic Party or the Republican Party to actually nominate the candidate. So what you've done is you've gathered the delegates at the state levels through these mechanisms, the primaries and caucuses, and now those delegates that you've selected go to the national convention to actually select and nominate the candidate. Sure, the candidate has already been selected. We know by the number of delegates and who they're going to vote for. So in ages past, perhaps, the nominating convention had more importance. It was more real. It was a true deliberation. Now it's more really just a media event. Much more, too, than not simply nominating the candidate for a national convention. As I'm going to show, they're also going to develop the platform for the party at the national level. And that is big. That is an important task that has a lot of key repercussions for the next 4 years. Evaluating the primary and caucus system means that there's going to be a disproportionate attention to the early ones, that prominent politicians are going to find it difficult to make time to run. If you're an incumbent, if you're a President Obama, right, or if you're a sitting Secretary of State, right, a la Hillary Clinton, you're going to find it very difficult to run for office while you're in office because the demands of this constant campaign is so onerous. The travel, the speeches, the coordination. And so prominent politicians are going to find it difficult to make time to run given the competition for delegates and this party mechanism that helps nominate and select candidates. One would argue that money plays a huge role. The larger the nominating process, the search, the competition for delegates, the more money you're going to need. The longer your campaign, the more organized, the more professional your campaign needs to be, the more money you're going to need. But now, again, we're talking about the pros and cons to pluralism and to democratic theory. Running a long campaign where you're really being vetted, where you're really being torn apart, and you're really having your feet held, you the candidate, of having your feet held to the fire, and you're having to describe who you are again and again and again for, in this instance, 9 months, means that your viability as a candidate is going to be pretty strong if you can survive that. We watched in the Republican primaries the candidates come and go. They didn't have the oomph, they didn't have the gravitas, the presence to maintain a candidacy for that long. So, again, pros and cons. Money plays too big a role. You can see both sides of that. The participation in primaries and caucuses from the party and the electorate is low. We're talking 20 to 30% of the voting age population. So the turnout is actually pretty low in relation to the entire population, the entire voting population. Unrepresentative. If you're talking 20% of the population, that's fairly unrepresentative of the population as a whole. And this is, a con for the primary and caucus system. Some argue that this primary caucus system gives too much attention, too much power, rather, to the media. That the media is deciding who's going to be covered and who's not, right? When you have those media events, who does the media turn to and who do they not? Are the media actually selecting the nominees by focusing on one or downplaying another? Primaries and caucuses, it's argued, speak to the base. So if you're a candidate running for office, you're running in a primary or a caucus, you're speaking to the base of that party. The base of the party is the party membership. The party membership who's going to vote in the primary, check? And so the base of the party, those party members who are going to vote in a primary, are often more polarized. They're more to the left or more to the right than the general public. So in the primary, you're running to the base, you're speaking to the base. And then you as a candidate for the general election need to switch back to the middle or reach a more middle path to speak to the general public. So you have to speak out of one side of your face to attract the party in the electorate. And then once you've received the party's nomination, you have to broaden your campaign to attract a more general audience. The seating of the delegates at the National Convention, you have a credentials committee that approves all the delegates. This is usually not controversial, but there have been disputed delegations in the past. I'm thinking of Chicago in the 1960s, where delegations from the South were discounted. They were not seated because the party and organization was afraid of the influence of those delegates, specifically, that those delegates would take away the nomination of the supposed candidate or the presumed candidate. And so it doesn't happen a lot now, but it has happened in the past where seating the delegates or actually credentialing the delegates, approving the delegates have been a problem. The main goal of the National Convention is to create drama, especially in the media-centered campaign. The idea is to have the media's attention. And so it focuses not on the platform process or creating the platform. It involves more now attention on the candidate's speeches or any drama that might be happening on a personal level between the candidates or between the candidate and the vice president. And so it's about drama and it's about attracting media attention. The highlight of the convention is the nomination of the presidential candidate, but because, as I suggested, the identity of the nominee is a foregone conclusion, the TV networks have actually drastically curtailed their coverage of the presidential convention in recent years because there's simply no oomph there. A few speeches is about what you get. Again, to nominate the candidates is one purpose of the convention, but then to create the party platform. So each state comes up with the state's party platform. So California has a GOP platform, founded in 2012, a Democratic platform, founded in 2012. And this is going to be true for the California State Republican Party. But then all 50 of those and the territories come together at the National Convention and they sew together a national party platform. Now, this is sometimes difficult, sometimes not, because there are regional differences perhaps in immigration or in Second Amendment or in women's rights or women's issues or any social issues. There can be regional differences between the North and the South, the East and the West. So sewing together those party platforms at the National Convention can be dramatic. It doesn't sell TV time. I mean, it's dramatic to policy wonk, to people who like this kind of stuff, but for your average voter, it's a snoozer. And so they don't really cover the platform process, which is sad. I like this cartoon because it shows the advantage and the disadvantage of the primary process. On the left, you have a bunch of Republicans, right? A bunch of candidates, Republican candidates, jumbled and massed and confusion and striving for office. And on the right, you have, in this instance, President Obama running as a Democrat in 2012, standing alone. And so from the outset, President Obama was the nominee. And so he was able to run from the beginning, unchallenged, and have full support of his party organization and have the support of the media, and he was a clear candidate. As opposed to pluralistic model of the Republican candidates vying for office in the primary system, he had a much stronger chance because he was able to run earlier and more clearly. So the next stage are the general elections. And so ballots, you have what's called an office ballot, which is a block ballot, groups of candidates for elective office together under the title of the office, and that's what we have. So you have president, and then you have the list of candidates. That's how we do it in California. This is a state-by-state process, the election process. Another is the party column that lists the candidates in columns arranged by parties. So you would have the Democratic column that would have the
candidate for presidency, representative, Senate, anybody who's running in that election, and then the Republican column, the Libertarian column, the Green column. And so you vote by party identification. There's also voting by mail. And so if you're considering voting, if you haven't registered to vote, this can be very convenient, the voting by mail, right? And so this is absentee voting. The pro of this is more people tend to take advantage of it because they don't have to deal with getting to the voting booth, getting to the polling place on election day. The downside of this, if you're a voter, is the excitement and the civic duty of getting up out of your office, out of your home, off your couch, and getting to the voting booth and getting to the polling place, and the excitement of actually going to the voting booth. There is a psychological payoff for that. It's very ennobling. There is voter fraud. Two elements of this might be the failure to purge electoral rolls of voters who have died or moved, and it opens up the possibilities of fraud. Another possible fraud, and this happened in the 2000 election, especially in the state of Florida, where in some locales, voting officials have purged many legitimate voters from the rolls by mistake, or seemingly by mistake. And so one thing that you can do is you can purge anybody from the voting rolls who are in prison, on parole, or convicted felon. And so what you're doing then is you're dealing, in California's instance, with 38 million names, 38 million potential voters. And so that's a hell of a task. Even if you go county by county, it's going to be confusing, and it's going to be fraud, and it'll be fertile ground for mistakes to happen. How elections work: elections socialize and institutionalize political activity. We get up off the couches, we get out there, and we actually pull the lever. We know that there are three types of elections. There are this party nominees election, which is the primary election. We've covered that. There is the election to select office holders, which is the general election. And then there's also elections to select options on specific policies. Now, this is at the state level. There is the referendum, or the state level method of direct legislation, that gives voters the chance to approve a proposed piece of legislation or a constitutional amendment at the local level. And then there's the initiative process, where voters are permitted in some states to put a proposed change to a vote given the sufficient number of signatures. So you can either have a referendum or a question posed to the people, or you can have an initiative where the people speak directly, putting a question on the ballot by petition. So again, three types of election: the party nominees, the primary elections; the office holders, which is the general elections; or specific policies through the referendum and the initiative process. The Electoral College. Wow, now this is an interesting component of our election processes in the United States. It's very unique, and it has some definite pros and cons. And my job, if I do it right, is to talk about it and then relate it to our seminar question, which is democratic theory and pluralism. We have to define our terms. An elector isn't us. I've been talking a lot about the electorate, or the voters in the population, the party in the electorate. That's not who we're talking about. We're talking about electors, that is a specific office, a specific duty, that is a member of the Electoral College that selects the president and the vice president. Each state's electors are chosen in each presidential election year according to those states' laws, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The total numbers of electors today is 538. So this is equal to 100 senators and 435 members of the House, and the 3 electors from the District of Columbia. In order to be elected president or vice president, you need 270 electoral votes. This is just the definition. I wanted to put this out here quickly. A little background. How did the Electoral College form, and what was its purpose? So in order to appreciate this Electoral College, it's essential to understand the historical context and the problems that the Founding Fathers faced. So imagine, you're 1788. How do you choose a president? Remembering the main compromises met by the drafters in Articles 1, 2, and 3, I said that one of the main compromises was how to elect the president. The Electoral College was one of those compromises. So how to choose a president without political parties, because political parties didn't exist at the time. So everything that I've been yammering about the party and organization, doesn't exist. Without national campaigns, and without upsetting that carefully crafted Madisonian balance between Congress on the one hand and the states and the federal government on the other hand. The origins of the Electoral College go back to the Holy Roman Empire and actually the College of Cardinals in the Catholic Church. So what you have then is the founding generation being classically schooled, appreciating the concept of electors in the Holy Roman Empire, where an elector was one of the princes of the German state who had the right to participate in the election of the Holy Roman Emperor. Remember King George I of Britain? I made a big deal when we did our Declaration of Independence lecture that he was the Elector of Hanover. He was the German prince who, as the head of state of Hanover, had the authority, the duty to elect, to participate in the election of the Holy Roman Emperor. So he was the Elector of Hanover. So this is the model, this is the mechanism that we're talking about. The term college comes from the Latin collegium, which refers to a body of persons who act as a unit, such as the College of Cardinals in the Catholic Church, who vote as a body to elect the Pope. So at the Constitutional Convention, there were actually 3 proposals that were put out, and each one shot down in turn. The first proposal was to allow Congress to select the president. As I said in that lecture, the problem here is that if the Congress can elect the president is beholden to Congress. There's too much of a reliance, or too much of a unbalance then between the power of Congress and the power of the president. You need separate and equal offices, so that got shot down. The second proposal was to allow the state legislatures to elect the president, much as in the original Constitution, the state legislatures elected the senators. That got shot down because the same idea is true, that the president would be too beholden to the state legislature. The third proposal was to allow the popular vote, the president to be elected by the popular vote. And this was shot down. It was talked about, it was considered, and it was shot down. So remember that we don't have the popular vote, the popular election of the president. That is a misnomer. They had talked about it, they had entertained it, and they disallowed it, or they didn't accept it. So this how do we elect the president question was a stumbling block in the Constitutional Convention. And so it was devolved to what was called the Committee of 11, or a group of attendees at the Constitutional Convention who were tasked with the idea of coming up with a solution. And they included James Wilson and Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, David Brearley of New Jersey, and Roger Sherman of Connecticut. So these were the guys who came up with this electoral college idea. The structure of the electoral college can be traced to the centurial assembly system of the Roman Republic. Under that system, the adult male citizens of Rome were divided into groups of 100. And these 100 people were called centurion, or a representative of a century of 100 guys could cast one vote. Here's the idea. You have 100 guys, in this instance, or now 100 people, coming together, and the idea was to vote for one person to represent us, we 100. And then that one person would go off to vote. We're not deciding on the president. We're deciding on me, right? You guys are going to vote for me to go off and vote for the president. So you're voting for me because you know me. You live next to me. You work with me. You know my family. You know me as a person. And you trust me to go off and vote. Now here's the idea. It's the same mechanism as voting for a congressperson to go off, but the difference is you can't have the president beholden to the Congress, so you create a special institution, an electoral college, whose job it is solely to elect the president. And so you elect me, off I go, and I see a slate of candidates, and I vote for the candidate I think most proper. You've elected me to go on and represent you. Unlike Congress, that continues to meet for 2 years, the electoral college elects the president, and then disband. We have no other fish to fry. Right? And so the president is no longer beholden to the electoral college. The president is elected pure and simple, but you've filtered out the public vote, the state legislator vote, and the congressional vote. So you've gotten the public vote through the identification of the centurions, or the electors, and then that representative voice is carried forward to the electoral college vote, and that's the end of it. So this is the compromise. The compromise in the Constitutional Convention in how to elect the president. In the first truly contested election of 1800, you have the first true electoral transfer of power. So you had first George Washington elected for 2 terms, and then John Adams, his vice president, elected for 1 term. And then in the election of 1800, you have Thomas Jefferson truly contesting, being a viable candidate for election to the presidency, because you have the Federalists in the person of John Adams,
and the Jeffersonian Republicans in the person of Thomas Jefferson, and you have a battle of ideology. Again, there were no primaries, no conventions, no speeches. Newspapers were very partisan. Did I mention that Thomas Jefferson owned a couple of newspapers? And he was using his newspapers to lambast Adams. Oh, did I mention that Jefferson was Adams' vice president? And so you have the current sitting vice president running against his president, the leader of his administration in the next election, using his newspapers to conduct a campaign. Oy. Already in 1800, things are getting dicey. So campaigns were focused not on the voters, but on the state legislatures who chose the electors to go forward. Jefferson and Burr, in the 1800 election, one of the accidental results of the development of political parties was that in the presidential election of 1800, the electors of the Democratic-Republican Party gave Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr, both of that party, an equal number of electoral votes. The tie was resolved in Jefferson's favor after 36 tries, 36 votes in the Electoral College. And what that means is there was unseemly political wranglings. There was a lot of backroom deals, a lot of smoke and mirrors going on. 36 different votes to try to get to a decision on who should be the president. So since this sort of bargaining, this sort of backroom dealing was the very thing the Electoral College was supposed to prevent, the Congress and the states hastily adopted the 12th Amendment to the Constitution by September 1804. Since the 12th Amendment, there have been several federal and state statutory changes which have affected both the time and manner of choosing the presidential electors, but which have not altered fundamentally the workings of the Electoral College. And I'll talk about those in a second. But along with the trend toward direct statewide election of the electors came the trend toward what is called the winner-take-all system. So under this, if we have a number of centuries, right, and in California we have a sum total of our population, 38 million people, and you break that down into our 55 electoral votes, whoever wins the plurality of those votes, the most votes, wins all electoral votes. And so since this 12th Amendment was passed, the Electoral College continues to work well, and as it was intended. The problem is the states, by virtue of their ability to drive how their electors are selected, have rather skewed the Electoral College process. In 1824, as another really great example of the Electoral College and how it works, there were 4 strong candidates in the presidential contest: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, William Crawford, and Henry Clay. All 4 of these names should probably sound familiar to you, right? And each one of whom represented an important faction within the Democratic-Republican Party. So we're talking about the one party, right? 4 candidates from one party. The electoral votes were so divided among them that no one received the majority necessary to become president. Because there were 4 viable candidates, no one got enough oomph to capture the presidency. So according to the provisions for the 12th Amendment at the time, the choice of president devolved on the House, on the lower chamber of the House of Representatives, who selected John Quincy Adams, John Adams' son, despite Jackson actually having received the greater number of electoral votes. So this election is often cited as the first one in which a popular vote winner, if there is such a thing, failed to actually win the presidency. In 1872, another example, the Democratic candidate Horace Greeley, this is the guy who said, "Go west, young man," died during the period between the popular vote and the time the electors were meant to meet. And so the electors who were pledged to vote for him clearly were unprepared for such an eventuality and split their votes among other Democratic candidates. It really hardly mattered because Republican U.S. Grant had already readily won the absolute majority of the electors. But it drives the question, doesn't it? What happens when you're a delegate, you're an elector, and you're tasked to vote for a candidate and you're unable to? Can you change your vote? The states had to respond to that. So I like this election, 1916, because this deals with California. And so we remember in the 2000 election between Al Gore and George Bush, right? And it was contested in Florida because how the votes were counted, hanging chads, dimpled chads, there was all sorts of mechanical issues involved. There was also some improperly purging the rolls by Kathleen Harris, who is the Florida Secretary of State. We look at 2000 as
a good watershed for how the Electoral College should work or how a state applies its electoral votes. 1916 speaks to us as Californians because the same thing happened to us with different result. You had Woodrow Wilson and Charles Evan Hughes as the two presidential candidates. There was a snowstorm in the High Sierra and in the Gold Country that precluded votes because we're talking about a time when it was like very hard to get communication. There was telegraph, surely, but it was hard to get communication from point A to point B. The snowstorm in the Sierras and in the Gold Country caused a delay in reporting the votes from those regions to the state, and the state was being pressured by the nation to call its vote. Come on, call your vote. And they said, no, we have our timelines that are given to us through our constitutional authority to call our Electoral College vote when we do. Had California called the vote when the nation was pressuring it to, it would have gone to Charles Evan Hughes. And Charles Evan Hughes would have taken the presidency. Because California waited a few days for the votes coming in from the Gold Country and the Sierras, it changed the outcome of California's electoral votes to go to Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson became the president of the United States, leading us into World War I. In the end, it was a 3,000 vote margin. Okay, so let's think about the pros and cons for a minute. The pros and cons of the Electoral College. Pro argument, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. That the Electoral College intent, as it was created and amended in the 12th Amendment, actually still works. It's not the Electoral College that is skewing whether a president can be elected despite the popular vote. It's the state's winner-take-all rules that are doing that. And I'll show you how in a sec. There are actually 50 divided and detached sittings. So the California Electoral College delegates are drawn together as California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Florida. And so it's actually 50 different electoral colleges who are going to send their findings, their vote, off to Congress. It's 50 electoral colleges, one for each state. But collectively, they're called the Electoral College. This provides a detached and divided sitting. What we're so afraid of in our system of government is a strong force of personality, some kind of a tyrant, some kind of a demagogue, right? Somebody who leads by force of personality and charisma, capturing the imagination of the nation. Because it's 50 divided, detached seatings, it's hard to manipulate or to conduct fraud or to be malfeasant in 50 divided and detached seating. Not all 50 electoral colleges would be suspect. And so the Electoral College's existence helps provide a break or a filter against malfeasance. It's argued that there's the impossibility of an incorrect absolute count. If you're going to have a popular vote, I give you the presidential election between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, where it was a difference of about 100,000 votes, and then there were two subsequent studies done of the electoral returns of the popular vote, and each one came back significantly different. It was a very tight race, and they were unable to actually pin down how many people voted exactly for which candidate. So the idea of the popular vote and the impossibility of an absolute count versus the mechanics of the Electoral College that at least assure at the state level a viable model, a viable mechanism to elect the president. An argument is the importance of the office. This is the one national office that we have. All the other elections, whether it's for the representatives or the senators or local, governor, attorney general, mayors, boards of supervisors, this is the one national office we have. And so we need a specific mechanism to elect this one person. It fights regionalism. Because you have electoral colleges rising from the different states, each state is determining its own electoral college response. And so regionalism speaks to the states specifically. And so one state is able to achieve its own conversation about its election, its delegates, divorced, divided, uninfluenced from other states. So it fights that regional perspective. It allows a cooling off period. If you have the popular election in early November, the electoral colleges meet in early December, and the votes are opened in Congress in the House of Representatives in early January. So that provides a 60-day cooling off period between the popular election and Congress actually certifying the Electoral College vote returns. And as we know, anything can happen in 60 days. Okay, so those are the pros. Now the cons. All right.
You can have the election of a popular vote loser, right? A la Al Gore or Charles Evan Hughes, John Quincy Adams. The popular vote, if it's the voice of the people, is discounted. We have this notion of fairness that is one person, one vote. The idea that your vote, your vote, your vote have the same weight as my vote. One person, one vote. The Electoral College skews that. In Wyoming, you have a population of 563,000 people, and you have 3 electoral votes. Your Electoral College is your number of senators and representatives. Representatives is based on population, and everybody gets 2 senators, no matter the size, right? So Wyoming gets 3 electoral votes, 2 senators, 1 representative. But California, you have 38 million people and an electoral college of 55 delegates. Now, if you do the math, and you're looking at a ratio, you divide 563 by their 3 electors, and that means that every elector is going to represent 187,000 people. 187 times 3 is 563. And so you have an elector representing 187,000 people. In California, you take our 38 million and you divide it by 55. That means each elector is going to represent 691,000 people. So in other words, if you're in Wyoming, your elector represents you on a ratio of 3-to-1 vis-a-vis California. In other words, if you live in Wyoming, your vote has 3 times the oomph at the Electoral College than does a vote in California. And so the idea of one person, one vote is set aside by the Electoral College. With the Electoral College, as I suggested with the 1916 race in California, the shifts of a few votes, in this instance 3,000 votes, or in Florida in 2000 it was just a matter of actually at one point a couple of hundred votes, 500 or 600 votes. The shifts of a few votes can actually shift the outcome of the election. The counter argument to the importance of the office is this is our one national office, and we should have a popular vote. There is disparate voter qualifications. If you're dividing the Electoral College by state, each state has its own voter qualifications. In other words, are the ballots printed in one language or in several languages? Do they have newer polling mechanisms? DMV registration. Do they have voter registration? In some states they do, in some states they don't. They're going to attract some voters or disallow some voters. So disparate voter qualifications state by state. Since the Electoral College is a state-by-state mechanism, the existence of the Electoral College perpetuates or enhances the disparate voter qualifications state by state. Large states dominate. And so, sure, Wyoming has 563,000 people, and so their Electoral College vote has more ratio. But how many candidates are going to go to Wyoming? If you have a limited amount of time and resources and bandwidth in your campaign, you're going to come to the large states and the large urban populated areas in a state. So a presidential candidate isn't going to go to Casper, Wyoming. A presidential candidate is going to come to Los Angeles or San Francisco because that's where the oomph is. That's where the real electoral oomph is. So the con argument to the existence of the Electoral College is the election of a popular vote loser, that one person, one vote is set aside, that the shifts of a few votes can disproportionately change the outcome. This is the one national office, as it should be a popular vote. Disparate voter qualifications are perpetuated by the Electoral College, that large states dominate the campaign, and that urban versus rural dominate. And so what we've done thus far is we've looked at the 21st century campaign, and we've looked at the 4 stages of this process that include the primary, the caucus, the nominating convention, the actual general election, and the Electoral College. So voter turnout has key elements in pluralism because voter participation is very low in the United States compared with other countries. In congressional elections in years when a president is not elected, or what are called midterm elections, the turnout rates are even lower. The effective low voter turnout is important if you're looking at pluralism. The state devolves to a one-party state of those who vote, as opposed to those who don't vote. And so only those who vote are having an effect on the office holders. The office holders don't need to pay attention to those who don't vote. If you're looking at the constant campaign, the permanent campaign, if a legislator is trying to get reelected, they're going to be listening to those who vote and trying to get their approval of their actions. Those who don't vote then are discountenanced, not considered in the legislative process. And the next question is low voter turnout declining? Are we going down a rabbit hole? There are reasons people don't vote. Low political socialization, as discussed in Chapter 6,
The less political efficacy, the less political information, the less interest you have in politics, the less likely you are to vote. The lower the political socialization of the electorate as a whole, the less people are going to vote. One would argue that there is uninformative media coverage and significant negative campaigning. And so if you have media coverage that isn't engaging the public, that isn't getting the public interested sufficient to get off their couches and into the polling booths, then that's going to be an element in decreasing pluralism and decreasing democratic theory. Negative campaigning turns people off, and we have numbers to back this up. The more negative a campaign, the less likely people are to vote, because they're going to be turned off to the rhetoric. There is a perceived role of interest groups and of special interests in the campaign process, especially special interests as it relates to money, or political action committees as discussed in Chapter 7. The more people feel that special interests or political action committees are influencing a political campaign, the less likely people are to vote, because they sense that their efficacy or how effective they are or how effective their vote is decreased. There is a distrust of political parties. When we look at the Republicans, we look at the Democrats, and what the party and organization may be putting forward, the distrust of the population with political parties is increasing, and that has a correlative effect to the number of people who don't vote. Along with that, there is a de-alignment with the two-party system. You look at the numbers, as we suggest in Chapter 8, of people who do feel disenfranchised from the two parties, the increase in the number of people who consider themselves independent, the number of people who are no longer members of one of the two major political parties, the increase in independence. Now, independence being not aligned with any other party. There isn't a correlative increase then with a membership in, let's say, the Libertarian Party or the Green Party. There is no third party that is rising or capturing the votes of the disenfranchised. They're simply becoming independent from the two parties. Again, the main reason people don't vote, if you're standing around in a cocktail party and you ask somebody if they voted in the last election, what you're going to hear 9 times out of 10 is, my vote doesn't count. There may not be a lot of thought behind that or a lot of understanding, but the sense that their vote doesn't count, that lack of efficacy, is an important determinant in why people don't vote. So looking at the United States, you have vote percentage of the population as a whole as an average between 1945 and 2005, where Italy at the high, you have 93% voter turnout. And then you have the United States at 48%. And so this is what we're dealing with. The voting age population actually turning out 48% of the population. Why do voters say they don't vote? They're too busy. They have too much going on. It's too difficult to register. That there's too much of a difficulty in absentee voting. That the number of elections is just too much. There's too many elections. Voter attitudes, now this is, efficacy, distrust of the parties, distrust of special interest, and one would argue the weakened influence of political parties. One of the jobs of political parties was to get out the vote, to get people engaged and enthused about an election. If the party's influence in the electorate is declining, then their weakened influence is going to result in a low voter turnout as well. So again, why people don't vote, and this is a percentage of people who are responding. Too busy, you have 20% of the people responding say they're too busy. You have an illness or an emergency that precluded them from voting, 15%. They're simply not interested, 11%. They were out of town, 9%. They didn't like the candidates. Now that's interesting. It's 10%. They don't know why they didn't vote. Well, there's an honest answer. 10% registration problems. They forgot to vote, that the polling place was inconvenient, that they had transportation problems, or that there was bad weather. No matter the reason or the perceived reason they didn't vote, the question is not voting a rational choice? Is not voting in and of itself a statement? Well, it's given then that the U.S. has a low voter turnout. Check. For whatever reason, check. Now, the rational abstention thesis suggests that some individuals decide that the cost of voting actually exceed the benefit. So they're abstaining rationally, that it isn't just because of bad weather. They didn't like the candidates or a lack of efficacy. They are rationally not participating. They're doing so by choice.
And this is because the cost of voting exceeds the benefits. So let me shut up for a minute and ask you then, what are the costs of voting? Now, this isn't just simply getting to the polling booth on election day. That's a half hour of your time. That's hardly a cost. What are the real costs of voting to you, the individual? Keeping informed. Who said that? Thank you. Keeping informed. Keeping up on the candidates. Reading. Listening to the speeches. Finding out what the platforms are. What else? Finding a way to debate choices with somebody. So if you have two candidates that are rather centrist, finding out where their points of divergence are, or do you mean talking to somebody else and having a good conversation?
Both.
Both. Excellent. Very good. Thank you.
And it takes a lot of time.
It takes a lot of time to educate yourself and to find out the intricacies. And it is, we are inundated. It is difficult. Thank you. And it does take time, especially when you're just trying to keep body and soul together, right? And you don't have a lot of time to play with as it is. Yes, sir.
Finding reliable, unbiased sources of information.
Finding reliable, unbiased sources of information on candidates, no, absolutely, or on policy issues. And good luck with that, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. That's a very good point. I appreciate that. And just finding that, then you're suggesting, is part of the cost of voting. Yeah, absolutely. Very good. Thank you. Okay, so these rational choices that we make not to vote have its upsides and its downsides. Its downsides is that it is rational not to vote. It is a statement of not participating in the political process. Those who see clear differences between the parties are likely to vote. Those who see no difference or little difference between the two parties, the Tweedledee, Tweedledum idea, that they're really just two sides of the same coin, if indifferent, then one may rationally, i.e. on a logical basis as a course of action, then abstain from voting. But this has relation to your sense of political efficacy, the belief that your political participation really matters. And again, this relates to low political socialization. The lower political socialization you have, the more likely you are to see that your vote doesn't count. Low political efficacy. If your vote doesn't count, it's a rational choice not to vote. It's a rational decision. If it doesn't matter anyway, and not just voting, finding good sources of information, all these things that we're talking about, you have a rational decision not to vote. This is counterbalanced by the idea of a civic duty. Now, this is also a part of political socialization. Even if you feel that your vote doesn't count, or if there's no real choice between candidates or between parties, or it's really hard to find good political information, that you still have a civic duty to participate in a democratic government, that citizens should always vote. Well, is voting the only way to participate in an election? You have conventional political participation, where political participation that attempts to influence the political process through well-accepted, often moderate forms of persuasion. Unconventional forms of political participation, not using the vote as your predominant mechanism, includes protests, boycotts, picketing, writing letters to the editor. Voting is only one way of expressing your political attitudes. It is, one would argue, a rational choice not to vote, but is this followed up with other choices of not participating? Do you not at least pay attention in some way to the news or to political issues, to campaigns and elections? There's always something going on, especially at the local level, that you can become interested in or you can participate in. So in California, initiative process, as you suggest, getting active in putting initiative on the ballot, gathering signatures. If you're really into a issue, if you're into medical marijuana, if you're into euthanasia, if you're into protecting animals, whatever your issue might be, you can still participate in the political process through a variety of mechanisms. Protesting, letter writing, gathering signatures, picketing. So voting isn't the only way to participate in an election. Does low voter turnout really matter? Some argue that it's not a critical problem, based on belief that preferences of non-voters are not much different from those who vote, that having a low 48% voter turnout is still a strong mechanism for gauging the temperature in the public mind. The results would be the same regardless if we have 48% of the vote or 93% of the vote. The end result is going to be the same. Since non-voting is voluntary, non-voting is driven by an acceptance of the status quo. If you're really dissatisfied with the status quo, you would vote. Non-voting
is representative of your being satisfied with the status quo. Since you have a means of participating and you choose not to use it, then the inference is that you are satisfied with the way things are running. If you were dissatisfied, you would use the mechanism to change things. Others believe that low voter turnout is a problem, that voters do not represent non-voters, that they are of a different mindset. This idea of accepting the status quo is a good hallmark for that. If those who are voting don't accept the status quo, if they vote because they don't accept the status quo, if they're trying to change government, then they are not the same as non-voters, just by that mechanism alone. Social makeup and attitudes of non-voters today are significantly different from those of voters. You have, if it were motivated, a very strong worldview in the non-voting population. If you use the reasons for low voter turnout as a rubric or as a mechanism, if people are just striving to keep body and soul together, if they don't have the time to ferret out good, solid, rational, balanced information, if they can't take the time to look at the initiatives on a ballot, if they can't commit the time that it takes to be a good voter, then you're dealing with a specific population, those people who are so pressed, they're just keeping body and soul together that they don't have the time. If they were actuated, if that population were engaged, it might have the motive power to change government. I'm thinking parties. So we always have two parties. We're always going to have two parties. Imagine that 52% of the population that's not voting, if they voted, if they were motivated, if they actually got to the voting booth, they might have the motive power to introduce a new third party. So the social makeup and the attitudes of non-voters today are different from those of the voters. They tend to be low income, they tend to be younger, blue collar, less educated, and more heavily minority based. So imagine if they had the motive energy to vote, how that might change the political discourse. We look at voter turnout over time, and so this chart goes from 1892 to 2004. And we see then 1896, 1900, you have voter turnout of about 80%, going to an all-time low of 50%, 48% in 1924 during the Great Depression, and then going back up in the 40s and then back down to where we are today in the mid-50s. Voter turnout over time is a long, sustained drop in the United States electorate. So voter turnout patterns, the proportion of the voting age population that votes, 40% of the eligible adult population votes, 25% are occasional voters, and 35% rarely vote. Elements that are contributing to voter turnout, as we said, are education. Voters tend to be more educated. Income. Voters tend to have higher incomes. People who are older vote more often. This is the life cycle effect, as discussed in Chapter 6. So younger people tend to vote less, again, unless there's a charismatic personality, like Barack Obama in 2008. The low age of the voting population was significant. Younger people came out to vote in droves like they hadn't before, and that was by virtue of the charismatic personality, the person of Barack Obama. Gender, women vote at the same rate or slightly higher rate than men. Race and ethnicity, whites vote more regularly than African Americans. This is also correlative to income and education differences between the two groups, so there is correlation. Hispanics vote less often than African Americans, and they have the potential to wield more influence given their increased size, the growth of the Latino population, especially in California. Their interest in politics are also relevant. The political socialization as it relates to age, income, gender, education, and whether they consider their post-political socialization high, whether they have strong political knowledge, a strong sense of political efficacy, all discussed in Chapter 6. So again, just to put another nail in this coffin of this argument, the factors of influencing voters are age. So in this instance, we have in the presidential election of 2000, election by age group, where you have 18 to 24 with a 32% reported turnout, and then watch the numbers raise from age 25 to 34, 43%, 35 to 44, 55%, 45 to 54, you see the numbers go up. So the older you get, the more you vote. Now it's almost a flip. 18 to 24, 32%, 65 to 74,
70%. The older you are, the more you vote. Years of completed school. The more education you have, the more you vote. Income. The more income you have, the more you vote. Older you are, the more education you have, the more income you have, the more you vote. So I go back to my contention. What is the result of low voter turnout to our political discourse, to pluralism? What you have are the younger people, the less educated people, and the people with less incomes being separated out from the voice governing, or from the population that's actually electing our representatives. So if you look at it from the permanent campaign standpoint, my argument initially that the first thing you do, well, the second thing you do when you sit down at your desk is to begin to run for office again. Who are you going to try to attract? The people who vote. And so your policy issues and your mindset, looking at your constituency globally, surely, looking at all the people in your representative district, sure. But if you're trying to get reelected and you're looking at a policy issue, let's say it's on immigration, let's say it's on healthcare, let's say it's on education funding, who are you going to attract? The older voter, the voter with more education, and the voter with more income. And so your policy decisions, if they're driven at all by the permanent campaign, are going to be skewed toward these elements, skewed toward these demographics. So if you're looking at the permanent campaign and governance, and whether it helps or hinders pluralism, how a legislator votes on a piece of policy by virtue of their ability to get reelected. So there are efforts to improve voter turnout. You can make registration easier. This is the motor voter bills, right, where you can get your driver's license or you can register your car and at the same time register to vote, because everybody's going to be generally getting a driver's license. Many more people are going to get their license that are going to be registered to vote. So you can use that motor voter connection then to get people registered. If you look at the demographics of those people who aren't being registered, you're dealing with younger, lower income, less educated people. And so the motor voter bill is going to, let's see, if we look at the demographics of the Democratic Party versus the Republican Party, the Democratic Party is going to be benefited by motor voter, because it's going to attract those people who would more traditionally be members of the Democratic Party. How about making Election Day a holiday? It used to be back in the early days, up until the 1850s, 1860s, it was a national holiday, Election Day. It was a civic event. And people turned out and there were parties. Well, that may help improve voter turnout. Strengthening parties. I've said that parties and their influence have declined since the age of television and the age of the internet and the candidate-centered campaign. If we can somehow find a way to strengthen party organization and party participation in the conversation, we might be able to get a higher voter turnout. If you look at the numbers of voter turnout from the 80s and 1890s, right, down to where we are today in the high 40s, maybe strengthening parties would help. Campaign finance reform. If one of the main complaints about elections and campaigns is that interest groups have overbearing influence, then higher or more stringent campaign finance reform might actually improve voter turnout. So we're looking at campaign financing as freedom of speech. I think I mentioned before in Chapter 4 that if you have $1, and if you want to give that dollar to a political candidate, then that constitutes freedom of speech. It's symbolic action. Now, if you have $1 million and you want to give it to a candidate, is there a balance between your freedom of speech and assuring fair and competitive election? There's a balance. And so the courts, because the courts determine what civil liberties are by virtue of the Constitution's interpretation, then it's going to be the courts that are going to be determining what campaign finance reform is. The maze of campaign finance reform that's discussed in Chapter 9 is a web of legislation and court findings that together create this idea that money's influence in campaigns is troublesome. It's troublesome because it includes the idea of special interests or some kind of undue influence of the moneyed interests, the political action committees, on our elected leaders, on our legislators. So in 1975, Congress created the Federal Election Commission, the FEC, to administer and enforce the Federal Election Campaign Act that governs the financing of federal elections. The duties of the Federal Election Commission, which is an independent regulatory agency, are to disclose campaign finance information, to enforce the provisions of the laws, such as the limits and prohibitions on contributions, and to oversee the public funding of presidential elections. So the Federal Election Commission, an independent regulatory agency whose job it is to try to maintain campaign finance reform. The McCain-Feingold Act, that you may have heard of, it's suggested in Chapter 9, did away with the idea of soft money or unlimited contributions to political parties. But then there are loopholes.
like the 527 loophole. And there's no limits on this, where you can have an interest group who are supporting a candidate indirectly. So these would be the friends of Mike Corrali, right? Or the friends of Mitt Romney, the friends of Barack Obama. They're not giving money directly to Barack Obama's campaign or Mitt Romney's campaign, but they can run television advertisements, especially on policy issues that a candidate may also support. And so in the end, what you'll hear is, I'm Mitt Romney and I approve this message, or I'm Mike Corrali and I approve this message. Does that sound familiar? That's the hallmark of the 527. This is a loophole where organizations can come together to support a campaign, but indirectly. The problem is they can't coordinate with the campaign. So if you have the Friends of Mike Corrali, they can't actually coordinate or communicate directly with my campaign. They have to be two separate things. So it's a loophole, but it's mitigated. Citizens United, a Supreme Court decision that said corporations have the same rights as people insofar as campaign contribution. So when you add Citizens United and this idea of corporations having a civil right to contribute to political campaigns, and then you couple that with the 527 loophole, you have what's becoming what President Obama said in his first State of the Union address, an undue influence of corporations in the political campaign. If you're looking at special interests and you're looking at interest groups, specifically in Chapter 7, what you're looking at is the proliferation of political action committees. As described in Chapter 7, political action committees are those interest groups whose job is to contribute to political campaigns. So they're a very specific interest group, and they're registered and they're watched by the FEC, which is why I bring up the FEC, because their job is to coordinate or to watch the activities of the PACs. But created by law in 1974, it allows corporations, labor unions, and others to donate money to a political campaign through this special interest, this political action committee. There are over 3,900 political action committees donating over $212 million. They donate to candidates who support their issues regardless of party affiliation. And there's not any sufficient data that PACs buy candidates. I mean, how could you? What legislator would actually say, yeah, I voted for a piece of legislation because the pharmaceuticals contributed to my political campaign? You're never going to hear that. So there's not sufficient data to suggest one way or the other that PACs actually buy candidates. Having said that, here we have some examples. This is 2004 data where you have Microsoft giving $3,900,000, let's say $4 million, and the percentage to the Republican Party, and by virtue, the other percentage going to the Democrats, 53% to the Republican Party. Philip Morris, almost $3 million, 80% to Republicans. The American Federation of State Employees, $6,500,000, gave 1% to the Republicans, which means they gave 99% to the Democrats. How about the NRA, the National Rifle Association, $3 million, 92% to Republicans. So again, looking at corporations and how they contribute to the political campaign. The impact of campaign advertising. Campaigns are an attempt to provide reinforcement, activation, and conversion. To reinforce party affiliation, to activate voters, to get them off their couches and out there voting. Conversion. To convert people from one party affiliation to another or from one candidate to another. Mostly, really, campaigns only reinforce and activate. There is a selective perception. In other words, they pay attention to things that we agree with. So remember the focus groups. If a political candidate wants to get elected, they're going to respond to the party and the electorate, to the people who might potentially vote for them. And so they're paying attention to things that we feel. If it's a hot button issue, if we feel strongly about immigration or campaign finance reform or medical marijuana, they're listening to us. They're paying attention to things that we agree with, and they're going to reinforce that. They're going to say, well, you feel strongly about immigration one way or the other. So do I, and here's how, in order to reinforce and activate. That's not going to convert. If you're strongly anti-immigration and I come out with a strongly pro-immigration statement, I'm not going to convert you. If it's a policy statement, we're not having a discussion. We're not having a debate. I'm trying to attract voters who feel the same way I do. I'm trying to reinforce and activate, so I'm not going to be converting. This is really about party identification. Within parties, then, we have like ideologies. The Republican Party has an ideology, a plank on healthcare. That's significantly different from the Democratic Party's planks on healthcare. And so party identification plays into reinforcing and activating on policy issues that we already agree on. Now again, incumbents start with a substantial advantage. And so if you're looking at the impact of campaign advertising and campaign fundraising, incumbents are going to start with an advantage because 90% of our return to office, 90%. And so they start with a substantial advantage of electability. And if you have 90% chance of electability, your ability to attract campaign contributions is very strong. Again, we're talking about pluralism, right? In democratic theory. Vibrant, competitive, free and competitive election. If 90% of incumbents are going back and they're attracting all the money, do we really have a strong, competitive election? Are campaigns too expensive? Millions and millions of dollars every year are spent on television advertising. Fundraising takes up the most time of a candidate's effort. Just being able to raise money, to raise funds, to achieve a viable campaign is going to tax a candidate to their max. If fundraising takes up a lot of time, and as the closer the race becomes, the more money is needed, saying that campaigns are too expensive is one side of the coin, but does money buy victory? If you look at Meg Whitman in the last election for governor, she outspent her challenger 2-1. She was rolling in dough, her own dough, and it didn't buy her a victory. Too much money can almost be worse than not enough. Candidates still need enough money to... Let's go back again to pluralism and a free and competitive election just for a minute. When you're talking about television advertising, you're talking about a public discourse. You're talking about getting information out to the publicly and the electorate on policy issues, on what a candidate stands for. Sure, with the negative campaign and the negative side, there's a lot of mudslinging, but that's also part of the discourse. If you're looking at a free and competitive election, is it really fair to say that there's too much money involved? Because if the money is correlative to advertising or to candidate travel or to the public discourse, too much money is too much pluralism. Or is it? If you have television advertising that is misleading, irrational, fear-mongering, is that really contributing to the political discourse? Is television advertising really one and the same with pluralism? Understanding nominations and campaigns, concluding our lecture today, again, democratic theory and pluralism. The question is, are nominations and campaigns too democratic? Is there too much pluralism? Is there too much competition? Campaigns need to be open to everyone. In order to be free and competitive, they have to be open to everyone. But they are hugely time and money consuming, both for the candidate and for our society. Do big campaigns actually lead to an increased scope of government? Do large campaigns improve government? Well, they do involve a lot of communication. They do involve a lot of public discourse. But it's hard to be all things to all people. If you're running for political office, you're only going to be able to mobilize your base. You're going to be able to reinforce and activate. You're not going to really be able to convert. Do campaigns actually lead to the increased pluralism in government? You can argue both sides. Again, over the last 50 years, campaigning for public office has changed dramatically. We have today the modern campaign machine. Campaigns are impersonal. They're less party-centered and more candidate-centered. There's a rising cost of campaigns. There's the image-centered campaign and the professional or the consultant-centered campaign. We've gotten away from the campaigns as they were originally evolved, the conversation in and among the electorate. To conclude, the goals and tactics of political parties vis-a-vis elections and campaigns, both advantage and disadvantage, democratic theory and pluralism.